We are here with Paul Saladino. Thanks for coming out, man. I appreciate it.
What's up, brother? It's good to be here.
Yeah. So we are in Austin right now. You're on the tail end of a trip from Arizona, and you're on your way back to Costa Rica, and swung by to talk about some lipids, right?
Lipids and everything connected with them. We're going to go a lot of places today, Derek.
Yeah. So to preface this podcast, because I feel like it's worthwhile, this isn't a debate or to bash carnivore in any way. This is simply, me being curious about, the manifestation of atherosclerosis, kind of getting to whatever truths I can try and, discern, similar to what everyone else tries to do, is learn as much as they can from as many people as they can and consolidate their own framework to determine what's the best path forward for them. And I guess, you don't even really call yourself a carnivore anymore. You changed your Instagram name and everything. Do you want to speak to that briefly?
Yeah. So the backstory here is that I guess in 2018, I cut out all the plants from my diet and basically ate meat, organs, and fat for close to 2 years. Mm-hmm. During that time, I wrote the Carnivore Code, got interested in this carnivore diet, got interested in the potential for some plant foods to trigger autoimmunity in some people, which is kind of that's my framework, because I had pretty bad eczema for a long time in my life, and I had bad eczematous reactions throughout medical school, college, even residency, that spurred me to think about this idea, are all plants good for all people? Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of these ideas around the carnivore diet. Now, the end of that story, or the next chapter of the story, was about 2 years into the carnivore diet. I started noticing persistence of unpleasant symptoms. So testosterone dropped to around 500 total, sleep disturbances, palpitations, muscle cramps when I was surfing or climbing. And I started to think, okay, maybe long-term ketosis is not great for me. And I was definitely in ketosis at the time, monitoring blood ketones with a meter, not deep ketosis, but definitely ketosis. And so at that point, I started to dig into the research a little bit more and understood that insulin signaling is critical at the level of the kidney to hold on to minerals, to hold on to potassium, calcium, sodium, chloride, magnesium, and that in long-term ketosis in most humans, you're going to become so electrolyte depleted that it's almost impossible to resolve that with enormous amounts of electrolytes, right? You can take all of the electrolytes you want. You can do so much salt. Your body's really not going to be able to hold on to those without some sort of an insulin signal at the level of the kidney. I've experienced this. Tons of people experience this with long-term ketosis. So at that point, I had to really kind of look at what I was doing and make this sort of learning judgment that long-term ketosis was not a great thing for me and probably not a great thing for most humans. And at that point, I added honey and then fruit to my diet, and it's been an evolution since then for probably the last 3 years. So now I've been eating fruit, honey as my main sources of carbohydrates, maple syrup, raw milk, the lactose in raw milk for going on 3 years now, and feeling much better. Testosterone is 800, free testosterone is great. Sex hormone binding globulin goes down. We'll talk about this. Free T3 goes back up. Thyroid hormones improve. Cholesterol, lipids go down. Still, my LDL-C or my LDL-P is above what many people would consider to be optimal. And we can talk about why I don't think that's an issue. But certainly there are changes that happen in humans without carbohydrates in their diet at the level of hormones, at the level of electrolytes, at the level of lipids. And these are interesting to me. So I'm actually, when people sometimes meet me or they talk to me now, they say, hey, I want to go on a carnivore diet. And I say, you mean an animal-based diet, right? And that's just a term that, I think the term came the first time I was on a podcast with Joe Rogan. He kind of coined that term and we ran with it. I think of animal-based as just a framework, okay, most of your diet is animal foods, at least in terms of calories. And I think most of my diet is now, it's organs, it's grass-fed meat, it's butter, it's tallow, it's raw milk. And then I get a significant amount of calories from carbohydrates in the form of fruit juice, honey, et cetera. So yeah, so that's an animal-based diet. And I think that works a lot better for most people. Now, to be fair, and what's interesting about this is a lot of people would look at that diet and say it's still very restrictive, quote unquote. And we can talk about that because what am I excluding in an animal-based diet? I'm not eating grains. So white rice is kind of a gray area, but I don't eat white rice. I don't eat oats. I don't eat wheat. I don't eat beans. I don't eat seeds. I don't eat nuts. I don't eat leaves. And a lot of those foods are considered to be healthy by the mainstream. And so that is a similarity from carnivore that I've carried over, but I have started including carbohydrates in the form of the fruit and the honey. And the reason I do those, the intentionality there is if you look at a plant and a plant's life cycle, the intention of the plant is to move its seeds to the next generation in a colorful, sweet fruit. And if you look at plant foods and you look at overarching terms like defense chemicals, the lowest amounts of defense chemicals are in the fruit. That's pretty clear. And the lowest amounts of those defense chemicals actually occur as the fruit ripens. So you can see all sorts of defense chemicals. We can talk about interesting examples if you want, or we can go deeper in the lipids. But things like non-protein amino acids, these are lower, and other plant defense chemicals, they're lower as the fruit ripens. So there's these signals within the plant kingdom that say, hey, this food is less toxic once I'm ready for that seed to go germinate. And that's when I want you to eat it. So that's where I am now with the animal-based diet versus carnivore.
Now, just out of curiosity, because it's something you mentioned, what is the difference between like electrolyte intake needed to maintain adequate hydration status and electrolyte balance as a like chronic keto dieter versus somebody eating a healthy amount, what you would consider of carbohydrates? Like, what's the differential?
It's night and day. And I would argue, and people in the keto community may find issue with this, but I think that it's pretty difficult to debate, that sometimes in long-term ketosis, you cannot fix that electrolyte balance. You cannot really get there unless you give your body an insulin signal at the level of the kidney to hold on to those minerals.
Have you seen that study with the guy, I forget his name, it might have been like Angus, and he fasted for over a year and lost like hundreds of pounds?
Oh, yeah.
That guy, I forget if he was supplementing with electrolytes or not.
Well, he was in a hospital, so right, they can give him IV.
Right.
You know, I mean, an IV is like, we're talking oral, right? Resorption at the level of the kidney. If you give somebody IV minerals, yeah, you can correct that. But
I don't know if he was given, like, I guess he would have been.
He was monitored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then when you're getting enough carbohydrates, I mean, the electrolytes just sort themselves out.
Right.
I mean, I probably eat. So in the morning, I eat a grass-fed burger or heart or liver, and in the evening I'll have the same thing, and a lot of carbohydrates and raw milk in between during the day, probably on the order of 3,500 calories a day for me now. And I only salt the burgers in the morning and night. So when I eat meat, I salt it, but that's the only salt I have. So the salt intake is very moderate for me now, and I don't do electrolyte supplements. I don't do any potassium or magnesium supplements, and I don't get cramps. The potassium's better, the magnesium's better, the levels in my blood are better, the hormones are better, the sleep is better, the palpitations are gone. I don't get muscle cramps at all. So,
Okay. So, is there utility to a keto diet long term though for anyone? Just out of curiosity, like, or is it something that you think everyone should cyclically be implementing carbs to drive like nutrient partitioning pathways?
So there are these kids, right, who have really bad epileptic disorders.
Yeah.
And I think in some people with advanced stage dementia, a ketogenic diet does employ alternative energy pathways.
Yeah.
But for the majority of people, I think long-term ketogenic diets are mostly harmful.
Okay.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, that's an evolution for me. That's not how I felt originally. So that's something that I've changed my mind about for sure. And I think that even cyclic ketogenic diets, I'm not sure are beneficial for most humans. Like, I think that generally speaking, carbohydrates can be looked at molecularly, biochemically as a signal of abundance for humans. And I think it's fine to give your body signals of abundance if you want to be energetic, have vitality, have good recovery, have good sleep, have mental clarity, have libido consistently. So I think that when I see people employing ketosis, it's often at a cost that they're not really being honest about.
Okay. So, like, I think a lot of people watching are probably familiar with some of the transitions you made over the years with your diet practices and how they've changed. And now there's carbohydrates in the mix and whatnot. And you just mentioned the utility of them. We've actually podcasted before. I don't know if a lot of people know, because, I recently posted a podcast discussing, for parts of it, lipid, I don't know, but just like biomarkers and assessing what is problematic versus not. And there was a lot of people that were like, you got a podcast with Saladino, you got a podcast with this guy and this guy. And it's like, we've done one that was over 3 hours. And so if you guys haven't watched that, I definitely recommend checking it out first, because it was a pretty good, I think, primer for what will be this one. And we did cover, the, I don't even know what you call it, like the lipid hypothesis or whatever the title is for the traditional narrative around, LDL and whatnot. So I would definitely recommend watching that, because you did kind of answer the question in that in a very succinct way. And this will probably get a little bit more granular. But you reached out to me because you saw a clip, presumably about lipids and atherosclerosis.
And FH.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to just like what, spurred your message to me? Was there like a shit ton of people in your DMs being like, you got to check out this nonsense?
No. It's just, so I super respect Peter Attia. I've never been able to convince him to have any sort of conversation or formal discussion or debate with me about lipids. And so what ends up happening is that when I talk about lipids, it just ends up being me sort of talking around his points, which is fine. He and I can exist in space and have different perspectives and talk at each other rather than to each other. I'd rather just talk to him in person and do a live sort of respectful discussion about our different perspectives on lipids. And that's something I've never been able to have happen. So when I saw you talking to Peter, you were asking him, if I recall properly, about quote unquote FH, so familial hypercholesterolemia, essentially levels of lipids on a carnivore diet and how people could not be worried about that. And then Peter gave some explanation of familial hypercholesterolemia and the risks associated with FH. And so there were just a lot of things in that clip that I think we can unpack that will make the lipid discussion, I think, a little more rich for people and frame it in a way that's hopefully valuable. So we can start, let's just start with like the FH levels of lipids on carnivore diets, and we'll go from there. And I'll talk about, and then secondly, I'll talk about why I think familial hypercholesterolemia is a really bad model for quote hyperlipidemia in humans today that are not, don't have genetic FH.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth framing out to like what the narrative is around atherosclerosis first, because like I think there is differing opinion and nuance even within who are seen as like carnivore defenders, because there'll be people that will say, long-term keto is fine, and then there'll be people who say, you should have carb. Like there's different levels even at the level of people saying don't worry as much about LDL-C elevations or total cholesterol elevations. It gets like very nuanced even among the crowd that is proponents for that kind of framework. So just like the narrative around traditional views in cardiology and whatnot is, let me know if this sounds accurate, because I tried to sum it up as succinctly as I could. Basically, this constellation of things has to occur. Like each of them is necessary, but none of them alone are sufficient. And the three things are the burden of lipoprotein, endothelial health, and inflammatory response. Does that sound kind of like what the traditional view is in terms of what has to, three things that have to be kind of disordered in order to...
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think that the traditional view is basically the response to retention hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Something that's talked about. I mean, there's a 2017 European atherosclerosis paper that people always quote, and it's this idea that ApoB containing lipoproteins, basically the number of them influences the rate at which they are incorporated into the subendothelial space, which is the inside of your blood vessel. So if you cut a blood vessel, you'll see the endothelium on the inside, then this subintimal space, the intima, the subintimal space, and then some smooth muscle cells. And so atherosclerosis canonically begins in this subendothelial, subintimal space as lipoproteins are incorporated into that space, become engulfed by macrophages. They're usually retained in the proteoglycan of the wall. And the response to retention hypothesis is that the more of these ApoB containing lipoproteins, LDL, low density lipoprotein being the most common one, but there are others, but mostly we can just, for the purposes of this discussion, we can essentially equate ApoB containing lipoproteins with LDL. It's not technically correct, but we'll accept that. So we have LDL, which is the main circulating identity, getting incorporated into the subendothelial space in more, this is the mainstream view that I would disagree with, more of that LDL getting retained as levels of LDL-C or LDL particles increase. And that's the response to retention hypothesis. The more LDL, the more ApoB containing lipoproteins you have, the more of that gets incorporated into the subendothelial space. The more in the subendothelial space, the more that's retained, the more that's engulfed by macrophages forming foam cells, and then this long cascade of atheroma progression.
So what is the traditional view of how the endothelial gets damaged to begin with to actually allow this process to start? Like, is it seen as ApoB containing lipoproteins are like atherogenic in that they will literally like impact the health of the endothelial wall inherently? Or
I believe that's the mainstream view. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that more ApoB is associated with endothelial damage. And I think that that's sort of inferred in the model, because in order for ApoB containing lipoproteins to be causal in atherosclerosis, they essentially have to damage the endothelial wall somehow.
Mm-hmm.
there has to be some connection.
Okay. But I think this is where it gets even more nuanced too, because it's like there's the view of, elevated LDL is not problematic, but then it's like the traditional narrative too is you should not disregard ApoB or high LDL because it could be like they are atherogenic particles, but it's in unison with these other factors like endothelial damage that is caused by, an inflammatory cascade that is like, I think, I don't like, to me, it seems like some of the information that comes out, even in what is seen as like the traditional view, is not necessarily solely relegated to ApoB slashes the shit out of like your endothelial wall.
Well, okay. So the title of the paper from the European Atherosclerosis Society is Low Density Lipoprotein is Causal in Atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
That's the title of the paper. And in the paper, for the mainstream view, they show a log linear regression of incidence of cardiovascular disease with levels of LDL and statin trials and Mendelian randomizations and cohort studies and these things. And that single graphic, this log linear connection between LDL levels and CVD, cardiovascular disease, is used to substantiate the notion that low-density lipoprotein is causal in atherosclerosis. And at this point, I think that's not the whole story, and that's why I think this is important to talk about. And at this point, we sort of get into these semantic discussions of what does the word cause mean?
Yeah, I think you should define like causal and exactly what that means.
I think this is where it gets a little ridiculous. It's like, what does it mean that LDL causes atherosclerosis? So I'll tell you what I interpret when I see that, and perhaps other lipidologists would say, no, that's not what it means. Because when someone says LDL causes atherosclerosis, to me, that's the message that you are communicating to people is more LDL leads to atherosclerosis, full stop.
Yeah.
And that means that no matter what you do, and this is essentially what I see in the community, in the mainstream lipid community, this perspective that anything that raises your LDL, anything that raises ApoB is bad. Mm-hmm. Anything that raises ApoB is bad, and anything that raises ApoB is problematic because LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerosis. That's the title of the paper. And so I think that if there are lipidologists that believe that you must have other conditions around, then that should be discussed as well. And that's what I want to talk about today, is that there are so many modifying factors to that equation. LDL cholesterol, atheroma, endothelium, that suggests to me that saying LDL or ApoB causes atherosclerosis, that's a very misleading statement.
I think it's good to say and really get granular on that, specifically though, because a lot of people will quickly lump you into the camp of saying you can have a sky-high ApoB and not worry about it. But like, I feel like people don't realize that there's nuance even to your statements about it's not to be ignored in the state of like metabolic dysfunction and this and that. Like, that's where it is problematic to be high. Like, you're not saying ignore it in total.
Yeah. So if we zoom out, I'll get really high level. I want to get really granular, but let's get really high level. So the best way that I've conceptualized it is that I like the necessary but not sufficient idea that you need ApoB containing lipoproteins to have atheroma, right? So LDL is a part of an atheromatous plaque. Mm. And in mouse knockout studies, if you knock out ApoB, they don't get atheromas. And ApoB, just so people know, is this lipoprotein in an LDL molecule, right? LDL is sort of this carrier, essentially this, membranous balloon moving around the human body with multiple apolipoproteins in it. And one of those is ApoB 100, and that's what identifies it as an LDL particle. And so the idea that ApoB is necessary for atherosclerosis, yeah, I agree with that. Like, it's a part of an atherosclerotic plaque. Does that mean that ApoB causes it? No. And this is where I think of, okay, what if you had a fire, right? Wood is necessary to have a fire. If you're having a fire, like an old school fire, if we're going camping, right? There's lots of ways you can get fire without wood, but we need a source of wood to have a fire. But wood doesn't cause the fire. And just because you have more wood doesn't mean you're going to have more fire unless you have more wood plus lots of sparks. But there are many situations where if you had lots of sparks, maybe you have a pile of wood in the back of your house because you have a wood burning stove in your house. And if that pile of wood is next to something that's generating a lot of sparks, you could have a lot of fires. And the more wood, more sparks, more fire. If you have a consistent source of sparks, which I would connect with something like insulin resistance or some of these fundamental metabolic dysfunctional states that I think really underlie and are probably the single proximate causes, or the plural proximate causes of atherosclerosis, then if you have more sparks, if you have lots of sparks happening, if you have underlying metabolic dysfunction, then yeah, more wood equals more atheroma. More wood equals more fire. The problem here, and this is where the metaphor perhaps extends, is that wood is also beneficial, right? Wood can build a house. And we know that LDL particles are valuable in the human body, and I don't think this gets talked about enough. The human body, nature, quote unquote, if we get really kind of metaphysical, didn't design an LDL particle just to kill us, right? This is not an internal ticking time bomb. The LDL particle participates in the immune response. It participates in moving valuable building blocks for cells around the human body. I mean, we know this. Like, if you have animal studies and you give them more LDL particles, they're more resistant to infectious disease. Now, if you take the LDL particles away from these animals and you make them hypolipidemic, they're more susceptible to infectious disease. And we know that LDL participates in the immune response by interrupting things like quorum sensing, which is communication between bacteria or even viruses in the human body. So LDL and other apolipoproteins, HDL also, these are immune particles. So HDL, LDL, we think of HDL canonically as a good lipoprotein, but they all have valuable roles. And LDL is not just there to cause atheroma. It's not just like this sort of trap door that you have in your physiology. Like, well, if you get too high and you pull the trap door, you're just going to get sick. That's not how it works. It has valuable roles. So wood is valuable for humans. Wood can make houses, but if you have lots of sparks and you have more wood, you're going to have more fires. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's very high level, and I want to get more granular, but that's how I think about it. Like, if you look at these log linear progressions, right? And this is where I think the problem comes with this perspective. If you look at these log linear progressions of LDL levels and atheromas or cardiovascular disease in statin trials, in Mendelian randomizations, what we have to understand is that the context of the majority of humans on the planet when these things are studied is insulin resistance, is metabolic dysfunction. There are multiple studies now, population studies looking at indicators of metabolic dysfunction, whether it's metrics for metabolic syndrome, canonic metabolic syndrome like high triglycerides, low HDL, waist circumference, high blood pressure, or even a fasting insulin being elevated at a certain level. Like, the majority of humans are sick and poisoned, and we can talk about why. I think this conversation is going to wrap into a lot of things, and hopefully we'll be able to bring it full circle, why I think insulin resistance is so pervasive. But we can call it insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. Let's use those terms essentially interchangeably here. Mm-hmm. But I think if the majority of the population you're studying is metabolically dysfunctional for some reason, then you may see a direct correlation, a direct relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease. But what's interesting to me is that anytime you do studies, and there haven't been a lot of these, but there have been some very good studies. I mean, Framingham cohort has been studied to look this way. There have been other studies that have been done looking at men who have low triglycerides and high HDL, indicators of a more insulin sensitive state, so less metabolic dysfunction. Anytime you do anything to stratify the relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease, that gives you a relationship or gives you any indication of insulin sensitivity, you see a very different relationship happen. You see a significantly attenuated relationship between LDL levels and cardiovascular disease. And to me, that tells me there's something else going on here that's massive. And if you look specifically at Framingham, so if you look at overall levels of LDL and cardiovascular disease in Framingham, there's just a straight line, right? And it's going up to the right. And it says, okay, the more LDL you have, the more cardiovascular disease incidence in Framingham. But if you then stratify that in terms of levels of HDL, which are not the perfect proxy, and they're not really the best way to measure insulin sensitivity, but it's the best they had in the Framingham study. And you look at HDL levels of 20 to 35 or 25 to 35, 45 to 55, 65, and then above 85. And the curves, instead of one curve that looks like this, it's four curves that look like this. And the bottom curve, the people with the highest levels of HDL have essentially a much, much lower relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease that is probably accounted for by other things in the environment that can damage the endothelium, whether toxins, diesel smoke, pollutants, heavy metals, et cetera. So in the lowest group, right? So the group that is presumably most insulin sensitive, the relationship between the highest levels of LDL and cardiovascular disease and the lowest levels is probably a 2-to-1 relationship. Whereas in the other quartiles, in this case, it's 8 or 10, right? It's 8 or 10 times in the highest versus 1 in the lowest. And again, this lowest group, the highest HDL, is that relationship. You'll probably always see some relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease, even in people who are very insulin sensitive, at least by these metrics, because there are other things in our environment that can damage the endothelium and cause this issue for at least those people. So this is what's interesting to me, is that to say that LDL causes atherosclerosis, you have the same amount of LDL in the people with an HDL of 85 as you do in people with an HDL of 25. But there's a very different risk of cardiovascular disease. And to me, that means, okay, there's something else going on here. If we truly want to help people get better, we need to understand what the most important target is. What is the thing we should really be aiming at when we're treating cardiovascular disease risk? And I think that it's a hyper focus on ApoB right now. I mean, you have to agree. Like, I don't hear enough people talking about how do we correct this person's insulin resistance? How do we correct this person's metabolic dysfunction when people go to a cardiologist? There's no discussion of that. That's what's missing. So there's no discussion of this because there are no pharmaceuticals that we have right now that can really improve insulin resistance within a cardiovascular context. There are some that will do it, but they're used in diabetes and they cause other problems.
No, fortunately, what I would say, though, as a counter to that is among the people who are actually debating about this stuff publicly, I don't think anyone is opposed to the idea of fixing metabolic health. Like, everyone is a very strong proponent of exercise, move, get your steps in, make sure you are not overeating, like basic stuff. Whereas you might not get that from your family physician, but if you're even consuming the content that comes from you, you've probably also seen the content from the opposite side of the camp that might assert that ApoB is something you want to manually lower with pharmacology. But those people are still also saying, maybe you could give examples otherwise, but from what I've seen, the people I defer to that are on the opposite side are still saying, the same things about exercise.
Exercise, yes. Nutrition, no. So if you look at sort of these people, or if you look at the perspective around ApoB or around cardiovascular disease, there's really, and this is probably because the nutrition is where we're all disagreeing with each other, right? There's not a whole lot of discussion about what you can do in terms of your diet to modify your metabolic health. Sure, somebody can go out and walk or exercise, but I'll tell you what, Derek, I would say that if you or anyone listening to this is eating the wrong things, that's not going to help. You cannot out-exercise a bad diet. I believe that very strongly. You cannot go to Dunkin' Donuts and eat a donut full of processed grains, high fructose corn syrup, cooked in seed oils.
But it's like, who on social media who is debating against you is a proponent for any of that stuff? Like, I feel like no one.
Well,
it's like everyone's kind of arguing against the family doc who's not online debating against either side, it feels like.
Right, but there are people in the discussion who will just kind of throw their hands up and say, we don't know what's going on with the nutrition, therefore I think you should just focus on exercise. That's Peter's perspective in his book.
No, he is super intensive on managing diet for sure.
But he's talking about in the book that the nutrition studies are so complicated that we don't really know what's going on here, and you should just focus on the exercise.
I don't think that's the case. I've seen him get pretty, intensive on diet. Like, he definitely is not saying ignore it because it's complicated.
Right. But there's not enough discussion there around how diet modifies.
If you look at his diet, I bet it's not that different than what you do.
I have no idea what he's eating. Yeah.
He's like an investor in Maui Nui venison, and he eats a ton of that every day and thinks it's like super high quality meat, which I'm sure you'd agree with.
Yeah.
The majority of his protein comes from that. He has, I couldn't speak to the rest of it exactly, but I know the majority of his calories come from high quality, not shitty processed foods. And he's very, very outspoken about, well, maybe not as outspoken as you would want him to be, but like anytime I've seen him talk about it, it's very, highlighting the importance of high quality foods as well as exercise and also metrics of tracking if you are metabolically healthy. And he uses like very intensive metrics like VO2 max and things that I haven't really yet seen anyone talk about that stuff, which I think is, grip strength as you get older, bone integrity, like that stuff I feel like needs more highlighting because that's the really granular shit. I don't see anyone saying ignore diet.
No. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong about this, I believe in his book, he says that his perspective is that the majority of research on seed oils says that they're benign.
I don't know. I would have to read the book again to see that part.
So there's definitely things that he and I would disagree with in terms of nutrition. And
sure, yeah.
the granularity of it all.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, I would say the majority of the health benefits you would get from manipulating your diet would be imparted by, and I would think you would agree, but correct me if I'm wrong, like the calorie intake, the quality of the food and the micronutrient density, the ratio of macros relative to your exercise and needs, sleep hygiene parameters, aside from that too, like all that stuff is, I'm sure you're on the same page with. It's not like he's saying go slam a shit ton of seed oils.
No, but I think that the problem here is that when you look at the average consumer of health information, they're doing so many things. And it's so complicated that I think unless and I think that everyone is having these discussions, it's just I am going to highlight things as more important than other people are going to see. And so for me, the food is the most important piece. I think that most people can do some moderate amount of exercise and get some benefit of exercise. I think that if I had to look at diet versus exercise, and I'm not saying that you're asking me to make this juxtaposition, but I think diet is, I don't know that perhaps this is a false dichotomy, but I think that if you're going to optimize one thing, optimize diet and then optimize exercise. If you optimize exercise before you optimize diet, I think that your energy is not going to be there, your motivation is not going to be there, and it's kind of putting the cart before the horse. Now, I think that people feel differently than that. They will say exercise is the most important thing rather than diet, and that's kind of the perspective I'm getting. Now, let me just say here, this isn't meant to be any sort of affront to Peter. It's just that he is the person that I'm thinking of. He is the clip that we were originally discussing. And when you can't actually have a direct conversation with someone, then sometimes you end up doing these discussions about their ideas without them present, but that isn't what I want.
Right. Yeah. I guess when I was bringing up the, who's talking or saying ignore diet, I was thinking there would be some outspoken individuals that are asserting very concretely, this is what you should be ignoring, not necessarily, because I can't imagine you would see the majority of people you debate against also, have overall the same opinions of lifestyle practices and diet. It's maybe the types of foods they choose might be slightly different at the end of the day. And I guess obviously that's very important as well.
It's important.
Which we can get to.
And let's just also say that in these communities, I think this is the people who are most interested in this. I don't see mainstream medicine doing this much at all. I don't see people coming out of training programs and cardiology talking about how to modify metabolic dysfunction with diet. So in the communities we're talking about, perhaps we have gathered some of the most interested people in this. And let's just highlight that mainstream medicine appears to have not nearly the enthusiasm for these discussions that we're talking about now.
One thing that is promising, though, is the exposure of it organically. There's never been a faster acceleration of exposure of this stuff to people where they're interested in learning about health. Like Huberman's podcast is like second or third ranked in the planet now or something. And people like your clips get huge amounts of views, whereas just a couple of years ago, I'm sure you were 1/10 of the exposure that you are now. Like people care about this stuff and are looking to learn. So I think at least fortunately, you can see the kind of trends where people are seeking further education rather than just deferring entirely to what their physician says.
I love it.
Yeah. So.
I love it. It's just, I think that we sort of started discussion with the 2017 paper from, European Atherosclerosis Society and talking about this LDL causes atherosclerosis. There's not as much discussion in there about, and perhaps some people will think this is splitting hairs, but I think it's so important when you look at cardiovascular disease. Fascinating topic. Before I went back to medical school, I was a physician assistant. I did cardiology. I've always been interested in atherosclerosis. My dad had an angioplasty when he was 42. So I have a history in my family of early heart disease in a primary relative. And then now he has a stent. So my dad has accelerated, according to, having an angioplasty at 42, and now cardiovascular disease and takes blood pressure medications and takes statins. And so I have a family history of this, but I just think it's an interesting thing also because it seems to be a disease that is prevalent in our society. And so when you're looking at something like that, I think it's important to split hairs and say, what are the most important topics and how do we really make the conversation as clear, as granular, and as, I think, digestible and elegant for people as we can. And that's what I see in the ApoB conversations. Is it feels a little bit too blunt to me.
Yeah. Quick interruption from one of today's sponsors, 8 Sleep. This thing is stupid. Yes, you heard me correctly. It is stupid how insane it is. It is the most absurd piece of tech in my home, short of the fridge or something like really necessary. Like this thing is insane. If there was ever something to spend money on that would give you a essentially guaranteed return, unless you're already using something comparable that I'm unaware that exists, this thing will pay back dividends in health for both you and your partner. It is a basically unnoticeable but wraps around your mattress cover that has a pod attached to it that auto regulates the temperature of the bed on both sides, split down the middle, for you to not only get to sleep as fast as possible, but shift you into the correct sleep stages and maintain them with insane auto regulation features that basically learn as it goes how to optimize your night and every night thereafter to get you the highest quality bang for the buck on every minute you are lying in your bed. Not only that, it tracks all of your metrics just like a wearable would. So I used to use the wearables that would track your heart rate variability, all the common metrics that you would be looking to. This thing does it without having to wear anything. And it does it for your partner on the other side of the bed too, and splits it down the middle so you have your own separate metrics that you can track on your app. In general, a lot of you guys can probably relate that your partner probably doesn't like the room as hot or cold as you, or vice versa. And typically there's a meeting in the middle where it's not ideal for either of you, and you're flipping sheets on and off depending on the time of the year. You're doing this, you're doing that to try and get the best sleep possible. This thing, no matter what, will, even during a heat wave, auto-regulate you to the ideal temperature and cut it off in the middle to make sure that it doesn't screw over your partner who needs something totally different. In addition to that, it will wake you up silently with a vibration. So your partner doesn't have to hear your alarm when you get up super early in the morning, or vice versa. It will wake up each person with either temperature rising and or vibrations that wake you up silently without bothering your partner and waking them up with a blasting alarm. Absolutely insane feature. I love that one. And cool new introduction here is the Pod 4 that just came out today. So this is why I'm talking about it too. It's the newest iteration of it that is even more accurate. It also has even greater spectrum of thermal regulation, so it can go even colder. The depth of feature is even greater now. In addition, they have a Pod 4 Ultra, which is an adjustable base that fits between your mattress and your bed frame to add reading and sleeping positions. In addition, if you're snoring, it will detect it and automatically lift your head by a few degrees to improve airflow and stop you or your partner snoring. Absurd. Absolutely fucking absurd. This thing is crazy. So I would recommend you get the Pod 4. And if you want to go hardcore, you get the Pod 4 Ultra, which is the adjustable base that actually will auto maneuver your body for snoring optimization, or for just adjustable positions that are nice for not having to lie flat. But just the metrics alone, not having to wear something, and the temperature, like, to me, that's the bang for the buck in itself. But the auto regulation, the wake up features, it now has a snooze feature when you like tap on the side of it, so you don't have to like go get your phone. It's nuts, dude. They have some pretty bold metrics that I think are worth touching on. The pod is proven to give you up to 1 hour more of sleep each night. I wouldn't doubt that to be true. This thing is literally will make the most of every minute you are lying there. Get more deep sleep, up to 34% more deep sleep. There's a lot. It's crazy. So anyways, check out the link in the description below. And if you want to support me, use code MPMD to get $200 off of your Pod 4, which is the cover and the hub. And if you want to get the Pod 4 Ultra, which is the cover, hub, and adjustable base for the snoring, different positions in bed, $350 off with code MPMD. God, I probably just talked about this for 5 minutes, but check it out. There are very few devices I would talk this absurdly long about, and it's well worth it. So anyways, back to the regularly scheduled programming. So when it comes to markers of metabolic health, which we did cover a primer, I would say, in the first podcast, but just, you know, it's been a while, and I think it's worth highlighting. What are the most important markers then, in your opinion, if you were to look at a blood panel in terms of what would reflect atherogenic potential in somebody?
Yeah, so super simple, fasting insulin. I think that if your fasting insulin is low, it is very, very likely that you are metabolically healthy. And I think based on what I've seen, looking at people and essentially, you know, looking at a lot of labs, I think something less than 3 micro IU per ml is ideal, with something less than 5 being okay, but anything above 5, problematic. The reference range goes up to 24, Derek. You don't get flagged until you're above 24 micro IU per ml. So the majority population, I think when I last looked, the mean or the median was around 9 or 10 in the population. And so you think like the difference between 5 and 10 is pretty massive in terms of metabolic health, because if you're at an 8 or a 9, I would say there's something going on there. That is not metabolic health.
So if it, like, I know you're trying to get as basic of a like entry level assessment with the fasting insulin, because that's a marker that everyone can get cheap, right, easy, not too hard to understand, etc. So if you were to look at a traditional panel and you saw a fasting insulin of, I don't know, like, what's your threshold again? You said 3 is ideal?
3 is ideal, 5 is the threshold.
Okay, because like obviously some of this is a spectrum at the end of the day in terms of how metabolically healthy are you? And then anything below perfect, you could hypothetically be prone to this same, atherogenic burden potential, seemingly, I would think. So it's like people are looking to some sort of target that they can look to where they feel safe after they've hit such target. Do you think such a target exists where if you're under 3 or less, it's essentially impossible regardless of the other lipid parameters or anything else essentially that's like in a basic panel? Or how would you get kind of like nuanced on that?
Impossible to what?
Impossible to actually have plaque accumulate in the arteries.
Absent genetic polymorphisms like familial hypercholesterolemia, I think that the incidence of clinically relevant atheroma in someone with a fasting insulin less than 3 is going to be vanishingly small. Perhaps related to other genetic things that we aren't accounting for. But we can talk about familial hypercholesterolemia if you want, because people with FH can get atheromatous plaque without insulin resistance. But, and this is why FH is such an interesting thing for me to look at, they have clearly disordered metabolism at the level of their monocyte-derived macrophages. So even though they may be able to get atheroma with FH without a technical definition of insulin resistance, they have massive amounts of metabolic dysfunction in the level of their cholesterol metabolism and their macrophages. So the macrophage, this immune cell involved in plaque formation of someone with FH, has, I think it's somewhere on the order, I was just reading a paper this morning, 1,617 genes are upregulated and over 600 genes are downregulated in that macrophage. And so FH can be polygenic or monogenic, right? You can get a single polymorphism, single mutation that causes familial hypercholesterolemia, or you can get multiple. That's a polygenic FH. And in a monogenic FH, which is what was studied in this study, you can look at the macrophages and they are increasing their uptake of LDL much more avidly than a native macrophage for someone that doesn't have FH. They're increasing scavenger receptors, CD36. They're increasing uptake of oxidized LDL. They're metabolizing it differently. So this is what's so interesting about FH and why I think there's so much caution that should be shown when we're looking at familial hypercholesterolemia as a model for hyperlipidemia, which is what you were talking about with Peter in that clip. And that was why I reached out and said, hey, there's more to the story, I think. And this is what's problematic. And this confounds a lot of the relationships or these log linear progressions if you're looking at something like a Mendelian randomization, because the upper end of an MR, looking at LDL levels and cardiovascular disease, is going to be people with FH. And upper levels of LDL in many cohort studies are going to be people with FH. And the FH people do not have normal macrophages. You don't have normal monocyte-derived macrophages. There's something going on that we don't fully understand regarding these polymorphisms or mutations is probably the more accurate term here. And FH is very, very large. There are over 2,000 mutations that can cause FH, but at least in the monogenic cases of FH that have been formally studied, these macrophages, these immune cells that are at the heart, they're sort of central to the formation of an atheroma because they have to engulf this oxidized LDL through the scavenger receptors and form this foam cell, the beginning of the atheroma. They are not doing this cholesterol metabolism normally.
So my understanding is FH is a phenotype, not a genotype. So like you even said, there's over 2,000 different things that could contribute to it. And a lot of them are not known as well. Like there's a ton that could be infinite amount of possibilities for what is contributing to the unique genetic predisposition of X person who's included in this data set, presumably. So it's like, how do you make heads and tails of that? Because it's almost like you're lumping them into, you all have the same problem, when that doesn't seem to be reflected in the data. It's
very divergent, but we can study individuals with it and look at it. And there's a lot of nuance here. Now, to say FH is a phenotype, maybe that's the formal definition. I think that's misleading because what we're talking about here are genetic mutations. So I don't know how someone can say FH is a phenotype, not a genotype. And so people know a phenotype is your outward expression of something. So someone would say that I have FH because at some point in my life, I had an elevated cholesterol. But with my diet, I can modify that, and now my cholesterol is not at the same level. Mm-hmm. So is it a phenotype or is it a genotype? Because I don't have any...
But it's like, how'd you end up there to begin with? Like, couldn't you, some sort of genetic predisposition that made you, in response to your diet at the time, get to that level, whereas another guy might have not got to that level with their genetics?
Yeah, some people would disagree with you in terms of... this gets into Dave Feldman's model of the energy, the energy model of lipids. And I think there are a lot of ways for humans to modify their lipids. So I think that most humans...
But at the end of the day, when you feed people the same diet, they will all respond, like maybe its patterns will emerge.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there will be difference in like significant variation in terms of like they're not going to all land at the exact same elevation, LDL-C and ApoB and whatnot that you did.
Right. So I think that there's probably some variation, but I think a lot of the population is going to respond a certain way. So if that's the case, then you could feed a lot of the population the way that I was eating, and you would have a significant amount of the population with phenotypic FH.
Yeah.
So I think that that's different than when we're actually, for the purposes of this discussion, when I'm talking about macrophages, I'm talking about monogenic, which is a genotype FH. I think that this idea of phenotypic FH is kind of...
But now we're like disqualifying a set of data that is like the only thing you can really refer to when it comes to people who have this, predisposition in general, right?
Well, I think that not necessarily. See, I see it a little differently. I think to say that FH is phenotypic is misleading because like I can modify it with my diet. That doesn't mean I have a known polymorphism that leads to this all the time. People with FH or the FH that I think of, like, I don't think it matters what they have in their diet. They just have, so that's not responsive to diet necessarily.
Not to the same gravity as it might be for
certainly not
somebody
to
else.
the same gravity. I mean, these people are getting, very, very elevated levels of LDL. So perhaps that's the way that I would delineate it, that like, at least from what I've seen, and perhaps I'm speaking in a way that's technically incorrect if Western medicine is calling FH a phenotype rather than a genotype. But yeah, I think that there are people who have a genetic form of FH and it doesn't really matter what they eat because this is a polymorphism or mutation in the LDL receptor or in terms of other things that affect LDL metabolism, and that's not going to be terribly responsive to diet. But I think there are a lot of people who can massively change the amount of LDL in their blood with diet, and we can talk about that. And this is something that I experienced. This is something that a lot of people that Dave Feldman has worked with have experienced, and this is something a lot of people on the carnivore diet experience. Now, there's nuance there that we didn't really get into around elevations of LDL on a carnivore diet. Perhaps I'll just mention that for a moment, but I don't want to move on from this if there was something else you wanted to say.
No, yeah, like I'm still like teeing up intros for different subjects, so like if we can tangent and circle back, that's cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you want to like discuss how you went from, I don't know, like even assessing that what your blood values equated to, you wanted to learn why, the diet resulted in this to begin with and what your findings were, and then how you've arrived at where you are now and what your current, understanding is of it.
Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about things that I've observed that change LDL. And we can talk about LDL-C or we can talk about LDLP, but there are things in the human environment that can change ApoB containing lipoproteins. And to sort of tie it back to what we were just talking about, there are also apparent genetics that will raise LDL, I think, independent of diet. So if we talk about dietary, lifestyle-related changes in LDL, I think that the most important thing that I've seen, or something that we should talk about for sure, is that polyunsaturated fats lower ApoB. That's well known. And saturated fats may raise it slightly or just don't lower it. And so what we see is that in populations of humans who are eating more polyunsaturated fats and potentially even monounsaturated fats, but more polyunsaturated fats or less saturated fats, we see lower levels of ApoB. And this is really interesting to me.
And that's when calories are equated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But calories are something that can affect ApoB as well. Now, what's interesting and what doesn't often get discussed with this is that there are multiple studies that show that when you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, the studies I'm thinking of are using linoleic acid, an 18-carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, to replace saturated fats from animals. You see lower ApoB, but more oxidized LDL and more LP(a). And so clearly, and we can circle back or dive deep on this, there are many studies that also corroborate this finding, showing that the more linoleic acid in the human diet, or the more polyunsaturated fats in general, the more oxidation of LDL, the more oxidized LDL there is. And in many cases, the more LP(a) there is. Now, LP(a) is a subset of an apolipoprotein that's similar to LDL with an apolipoprotein a attached to the LDL molecule. So that's a different type of sort of apolipoprotein that involves human lipid metabolism, is involved in human lipid metabolism. So lowering LDL with polyunsaturated fats consistently results in more oxidized LDL and more LP(a). So we'll pause on that. You can also, I think, affect the amount of LDL in your bloodstream with the amount of carbohydrates in your diet. And this gets into Dave's ideas around the lipid energy model. Dave's published a paper on this. He's a much better person to talk to than I. And I don't necessarily agree with this completely because I think that it leaves out the possibility that on very low carbohydrate diets, you have changes in your thyroid, which are suboptimal. So the thing that I think people in the carnivore communities are ignoring around quote unquote hyperlipidemia on low carb diets is this changes in thyroid hormone physiology. And so if I look back at my blood work when I was on carnivore and keto, all I have is total T3. And unfortunately, I'm comparing it to free T3 now.
But so it was all bound up is what you were thinking?
Well, I didn't measure.
But that would be your assumption based on biofeedback, presumably?
No, I didn't measure free T3 when I was on a carnivore diet. I just measured total T3. That was just the labs that I was getting.
Right.
So I can compare, but what I've seen with people is that when you go on a ketogenic diet, your free T3 goes very low.
Yeah, so like the binding proteins elevate similarly to SHBG.
Yeah. And the total T3 goes low as well because on a carnivore diet, my total T3 was low. And this was something I was puzzling about during the diet because your TSH generally stays the same. This is something that's well documented in ketogenic circles and we're all trying to figure it out. And because of the non-change in TSH, at the time, I didn't really see it as cause for concern. But looking back, I think, well, that is associated with a change in body temperature. This is one of the other things I experienced on a ketogenic diet that was unpleasant and I think indicative of some problems was a decline in body temperature, mostly subjective, but when I would objectively measure it, there was a change. And so I think that people...
With the same calories and energy expenditure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I could possibly control for it. You know?
Sure.
Yeah. So, but I think that there is this change on long-term ketogenic diets where free T3 and total T3 go down, that the human body is down-regulating metabolism. You see this with decreased body temperatures, et cetera. And so when that happens, I get worried because lowering your thyroid metabolism, I think is a harbinger of bad things with regard to lipoprotein metabolism. So if somebody has an elevated LDL in the setting of a ketogenic diet, along with a suboptimal thyroid hormone profile, that's something that would, again, kind of get me to nudge them, as we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, include some carbohydrates in your diet,
right,
and then see where this goes. So I think that in the setting of a ketogenic diet, we must be aware of changes in thyroid hormone physiology, and I'm not okay with lowering free T3 or total T3 or lowering body temperature because I think that is a bad thing. That's something that I've seen very clearly in my time working in cardiology is that I would see young, middle-aged women come in with aggressive atherosclerosis in the setting of hypothyroidism, not due to carnivore diets at the time, but due to autoimmune thyroiditis, things like that. So that's another way that you can affect your lipids with diet and lifestyle is by essentially lowering your thyroid hormone, which is going to increase your LDL. That is something that I'm not indifferent to.
Okay. What's a fasting insulin of a guy who's on a keto diet long-term typically?
Low.
Okay. So in that case, do you think people could accidentally overlook the atherogenic potential of their, or would you assert that you still can't build plaque because the insulin isn't high enough, even though the thyroid metabolism and everything is all thrown awry?
We don't know. This is exactly what Dave is studying, right? Okay. So we can talk about Dave's study, but I think that this is a good point you bring up, that if your thyroid is abnormal, if your thyroid is not optimal, if the free T3, total T3 are not well within range and you're on a ketogenic diet, you could be insulin sensitive and that could be a situation where we have problems. So let's talk about Dave's study for a moment because it's kind of answering the same question, Derek. So Dave Feldman is an interesting citizen scientist, previous engineer who has been interested in this question for a long time and is doing a study with Matthew Budoff, a well-respected cardiac radiographer, doing CT coronary angiogram on people that Dave calls lean mass hyperresponders. And these are people kind of like, I guess I was, people that eat ketogenic, primarily low carbohydrate diets and have elevated levels of LDL, 300, 400, 500 milligrams per deciliter LDL. And you can assume corresponding levels of LDL-P associated with that. And so what Dave did with Matt, which is really interesting, was they took baseline scans of the coronary arteries. So CT coronary angiogram of the coronary arteries. And these are essentially people, he didn't do any metrics on thyroid, so I can't comment on that. But my assumption would be that...
Why though? Cost?
I think that it's just not something that he was thinking of. You know,
It sounds like the crux of a lot of this discussion.
Perhaps, but I wasn't involved in the study.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that Dave perhaps sees it a little differently. And I love Dave, but Dave sees it as an energy model perspective. And if I understand it correctly,
Isn't that like the root of energy essentially?
yes. And I think
Or
Dave,
one of the main roots anyway?
yeah, thyroid is. Yeah. But Dave would say that, I think Dave would say, again, it's not entirely.
I'm sure there's a ton of things I'm totally overlooking from how easy it is to set up a study. So yeah, I'll digress.
No, I think that Dave would probably answer the question differently, but
Sure.
The idea is that, as I understand it, that if you are using more fat for fuel, which is, we know that if you're on a ketogenic diet, you're going to have more non-acetyl fatty acids, you're going to have more lipolysis, you're going to have more beta oxidation, all these things, then your carrier boat lipoproteins are going to be more involved in moving that fat around the body for the energy. That's the perspective. Now, I think that, again, there are a few things I would add on to that regarding the thyroid.
Yeah, what is the explanation for why cholesterol is so much higher? Like, I know when he has had discussions before, there's been pushback against, like, explain why the lean mass hyperresponder has higher synthesis and or recycling that is like leading to a circulating serum cholesterol level that is like significantly higher than would otherwise. Like, what is the explanation for mechanism there?
Probably best to have that conversation with Dave, so he'll do it full justice, because he's the one that wrote the paper on the lipid energy model. But high level, that's what I understand, is that essentially the synthesis is significantly increased when you are using the lipids as fuel, when you're doing ketosis.
Even if your energy expenditure and everything is like, everything's equated, it's going to just like liberate. Like, I'm just trying to understand how it. And you don't know the answer. Either,
I don't know.
A dead horse
on
that question.
This is Dave's realm.
Well, like the reason I asked too is, at least of what I saw, and I haven't seen maybe his most recent stuff, because I kind of just looked into it super recently on the, preparing for this.
Yeah.
He didn't seem to have an answer for it either. So I'm just like,
yeah. Again, like I said, I don't. I love Dave. I think that,
like, I'm sure you keep up with his content though. Like, you don't know what his.
I actually haven't. I've been following his study on this, but in terms of the lipid energy model stuff, he's a much better person to explain the whole thing than me, because I don't necessarily believe that the lipid energy model explains all of this.
So yeah, just to like frame for people in layman's terms, alignment too, because a lot of people will lump you into the camp of, you agree with his thing, he agrees with Shawn Baker's thing, you guys all agree with each other, you agree with Michaela Peterson, like. Do you all have, like, obviously there's nuanced opinions, but it's like there's pretty significant differences that are worth highlighting, I would say, if they are indeed. So like when Shawn Baker goes on Joe Rogan and mentions, Dave Feldman's study and how he's seemingly aligned with that, at least the way he represents it, that's not what you are asserting is like the optimal.
No.
Like, it sounds like they're encouraging carbless carnivore.
No, that's not what I'm encouraging.
But is that what they're encouraging?
I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what it at least sounds like.
Well, I think that Dave is interested in this phenomenon whereby people, I know Dave eats carbohydrates.
Or maybe not that they're encouraging it, but they think that it's fine to walk around with like these sky high, lipid parameters in the absence of, insulin, because you're on a keto diet and there's no way to build plaque because, there's not enough sparks or whatever.
Right.
Presumably that's kind of like their framework.
Yeah, I don't agree with that completely. Hopefully that's clear based on what we're talking about.
Yeah, because I think it's key to say that though, because a lot of people will think you're just basically their spokesperson.
Yeah,
indirectly.
I don't understand that.
Yeah,
I don't watch any of Michaela, Shawn's or Shawn's content, and Dave. I haven't.
Not that their stuff is bad, by the way, either. I'm just saying, like, trying to differentiate between each carnivore advocate or person who advocates for the ingestion of red meat does not equate to like the same as the other person.
But you had to advocate for the ingestion of red meat.
Yeah.
I'm not a carnivore advocate. We established that already.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like that I get lumped there anyway. And I think I do get lumped there a lot. I mean, you did a thumbnail of me and Liver King when you were or your editor had this awesome thumbnail of me with a plate of meat and Liver King on the other side. When you were talking to Peter about FH, and I objected to that a little bit. I was like, hey, number one, don't associate me with Liver King in that way. And number two, I think hopefully at the end of this conversation, if people consume any amount of my content, they'll understand that my perspective is much more nuanced than just eat as many ribeyes as you want.
Yeah.
So, if we go back to Dave's study for a moment, because I do think it's interesting. So Dave is unable to share until December the 8th when Matt boot off. His
Yeah, so close timing.
I know. But perhaps you can, put an addendum in the introduction to this podcast about what those results from Matt are. And Matt is going to announce at a lipidology conference the comparison between Dave's baseline scans and a matched control from Miami Heart. And Miami Heart is a study that looked at the CT coronary angiograms of people without known atherosclerosis in just the normal human population, not, quote, lean mass hyperresponders, which is Dave's term for people who are doing these low carbohydrate diets that have high levels of LDL cholesterol. So we have one cohort, Dave's cohort. It's around 100 people. But I think the matched control is a little bit lower than that based on the ages that they had to match for with the Miami Heart. And the Dave's original data has been shared. So if you look at Dave's original data, I believe this is common knowledge, then the original CT coronary angiogram scans of Dave's cohort, people that have had, quote, elevated LDL for, I think, an average of 4.4 years, it was much lower incidence of, I think, radiologically visible calcified and non-calcified plaque than you would expect based on a similar cohort of people with levels of LDL that are that elevated.
What's their ApoB?
The ApoB, so if we look at the LDL levels off the top of my head, we're something between 300 and 500 milligrams per deciliter. So these are...
So in general, you would have, just by extension of that, over the clinical reference range ApoB, presumably?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you can, yeah.
Like, just highlighting what ApoB is, like, I know we did, like, this very, very scientific sounding definition, but there is, like, low density lipoprotein, high density lipoprotein, and what is comprised in the ApoB that you would normally see segregated on a typical panel. Because a lot of people aren't ordering ApoB, even though I think they should, but just like when you order a standard basic panel, you're seeing HDL-C, LDL-C, you might see like a VLDL.
Right.
Like, how would you, just for the layman, could you frame out like what is it, like the ApoB comprised?
Right.
That cumulative.
So the ApoB containing lipoproteins are chylomicrons, VLDL, IDL, and LDL. The main population is LDL, but VLDL can be significant. Chylomicrons disappear quickly and are ApoB 48 versus VLDL, IDL, and LDL, which are ApoB 100. HDL is an ApoA containing lipoprotein. So if you're looking at ApoB, you're essentially...
And LP little a.
I guess that would probably be, that's included in ApoB, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's actually something that's interesting if you look at...
I think is the number one genetic cause of atherosclerosis, if I'm not mistaken.
Could be.
Yeah. So that's worth noting.
It is worth noting, and hopefully we'll circle back.
Because like we're gonna get like super intense on the familial hypercholesterolemia from people who have unique genetic predispositions.
Right.
But like above that, people are with elevated LP little a are not to be ignored that are comprised in this ApoB number that a lot of people might ignore if we just talk about LDL-C ad nauseum.
Yes, and often, I mean, Sam Semikis wrote a paper in 2020 about cardiovascular risk when you correct LDL-C for LP little a. And it interestingly, and again, this gets back to kind of the ApoB conversations and sort of the, I guess, an ApoB measurement will account for this, but LDL will not. When you account or when you correct levels of LDL-C or for LP little a, the cardiovascular risk is significantly attenuated. So essentially what you see in that paper is that the majority of the risk or a significant portion of the risk for ApoB containing lipoproteins is from LP little a, and that when you account for that, it changes the LDL connection with cardiovascular disease. That relationship, that hazard ratio is significantly attenuated.
Okay.
So LP little a is hugely important. And like we mentioned LP little a earlier, it has a variety of biological functions in the human body. I don't think it's even fully understood. High level, it's thought of in some ways as a sink for oxidized phospholipids, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later when it comes to oxidized LDL, things that raise oxidized LDL. So, and I mentioned LP little a earlier when I said that when you change the amount of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat, specifically linoleic acid in your diet, LP little a does go up. That's consistent.
Quick note from another sponsor. This is Marek Health. Yes, Marek. You may have heard of it before. If not, then I'm doing a terrible job because it's my company. This is the go-to company for labs. So we're talking a lot about diagnostic metrics in this podcast. Lipids, metabolic health, insulin resistance markers, genetic predispositions, and determining the path forward based on your own unique situation, that is only done with elaborate and properly selected biomarkers. So this is where you would go to a company that not only offers labs, but knows what labs to offer to give you the most comprehensive and accurate insights with the most up-to-date literature backing the decision for the biomarkers included in their panels. Marek Health is the go-to. Paul's used them before himself as well. And we have very high quality medical providers and health coaches in the company as well that will not only give you access to these panels, but in addition, help interpret them for you so you can make a more guided decision on the diet changes, lifestyle changes, if necessary, potentially even pharmacology implementation if warranted. That would be worthwhile to consider based on the diagnostic metrics that you get and the constellation of factors that lead to the interpretation of them. So this is all very nuanced and something that you need expert guidance on, in my opinion. But even if you weren't to go the guided optimization route, just getting a comprehensive panel, even if you're young and otherwise seem in perfect health, I think it's totally worthwhile to assess any glaring genetic predispositions that may justify intervening sooner and or having baseline metrics to refer to should something go awry in the future. Having the baseline contextual information to refer back to is going to be something you wish you had, in my opinion. Like a lot of people, something happens, they are trying to work backwards at that point to figure out how they arrived there. It would be worthwhile if you had some data backing, time points in your life to actually see where you stood and what led to the state that you were currently in. I couldn't speak more highly to the utility of diagnostic metrics. This is why, I started Marek to begin with. I will put the link to the exact panel that I use personally in the description below. MarekHealth.com/MPMD. It'll link to the exact thing I get, and included with 100 plus biomarkers, the panel design for those seeking peak performance, longevity, vitality. We also include a panel review to actually go over your results and have an array of unique add-ons that are only going to be found by using the link below and also the coupon code. You get 10% off with code MPMD. And now let's get back to the podcast. I think most people are familiar that calcification takes a long time to happen. And it's kind of like, seeing the residual kind of like aftermath of what was the manifestation of, first signs of it kind of thing. And having this interpretation of 1 year, is that enough time to actually...
No, these people have had, so this is a baseline study. These people have had an average, I think, according to Dave, of 4.4 years with these levels of elevated lipoproteins.
Yeah.
And CT coronary angiogram is looking at non-calcified and calcified plaque. This is the benefit of a CT coronary angiogram, is it's much more sensitive. It's not just looking at coronary calcified plaque. This is not a CAC. This is not a CT, this is not a coronary artery calcium score.
No, I was trying to just differentiate for the audience between a CAC and a CT angiogram. But like the actual baseline metrics were taken 4 years ago.
No. So these he doesn't have the year follow-up yet. But what's interesting is they're looking at the baseline metrics, and the baseline metrics reflect 4+ years of people living with these elevated LDLs. And if you talk to Matt Budoff, that's absolutely enough time to see significant levels of, atheroma progression, right? So what's happening here is he's looking at the baseline data, is what he's reported already, and what you would expect after 4+ years of people with significantly elevated levels of LDL-C, ApoB, whatever. It's much lower than what you would expect based on the general population. So there's something interesting going on here. These people who are presumably quite insulin sensitive. Again, we're not discounting the fact that some of them may have disordered thyroid metabolism, and this may not be ideal. But based on this insulin sensitive population with significantly elevated lipids, the baseline data suggests that they have much less atherosclerosis than what you would expect just based on general population numbers. What's happening on December the 8th is they're comparing that data to an age match control from Miami Heart. And Dave is really tight-lipped about this, but I'm inferring that he's very positive about what they're going to see. Mm-hmm. That's just my inference.
Presumably from the baseline, though, you're going to see no development in the arteries of the lean mass hyperresponders compared to their baseline.
In a year, that'll be the findings when they report in a year from now when they do the second scan. But right now, what they're most excited about is just doing this age match control. Because
but what I'm saying is in 1 year compared to the baseline of themselves, that's enough time to where you would be able to see development in somebody who was actually building.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's something that we defer to this cardiac radiologist about, Matt Budoff.
And radiologists would all in general agree with that.
Yeah. He's a pretty preeminent guy. He's a pretty well-respected guy.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, from what I understand from Dave, he was kind of skeptical at the beginning of the study. He was like, of course you're going to see progression. So it's interesting. He's not.
Okay.
He doesn't.
Because it's like my understanding is people like atherosclerosis is like a very long process, insidious in that you could have it slowly accumulating since adolescence and actually manifesting into something clinically significant or something you could even see, might take multiple years, not necessarily 365 days.
I think this is the benefit of the CT coronary angiogram. It's quite sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's even those, I just wasn't sure if 365 days was sensitive enough even at that level.
Yeah, I think it is according to this. Yeah. Okay. I mean, from what I've heard, yeah. And this is a key point, Derek, and I think that this is something that they've really clearly established with this cardiac radiologist doing this study. So
okay.
And so basically, just to summarize for people, because that was kind of a convoluted discussion. So Dave's research, interesting to me, slightly different perspectives on things perhaps between Dave and I and how we look at lipids and elevations and things like that. Regardless, I find his research very fascinating. I think people should pay attention to it. And I think that when the results get announced, it's going to be something that people will want to discuss and talk about.
And the lean mass hyperresponders are individuals who are following a ketogenic diet.
Yes.
So then obviously the thyroid issues are not a problem for them if the results are positive, right?
This is what I was saying, that why it was an interesting thing to look kind of like at something adding here. Now, I would expect, this is just my expectation, that there's going to be, somebody's going to have some progression, right?
Yeah.
Of this cohort, somebody's going to have some progression. I think that my hypothesis.
Why though? If they're fasting insulin is rock bottom and.
Because of maybe the thyroid stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, so like I said earlier, right? If we take the Framingham data and you stratify it by insulin sensitivity, when someone is insulin sensitive, it massively attenuates the risk between LDL and cardiovascular disease. It doesn't take it to zero, like I said, because there are many other things in our environment that can affect atheroma progression.
So my understanding is you really like fasting insulin as a metric of insulin sensitivity because it reflects how much your pancreas is needing to work essentially to maintain things, at a baseline state when you're fasted. In this model though, if you have individuals who are rock bottom in insulin, but then they have disordered thyroids and they're still accumulating plaque, I'm just trying to make heads or tails of your mention of stratifying by insulin sensitivity in these, like Framingham, for example, when there's not the metrics you would defer to for insulin sensitivity, like you're using a proxy of HDL.
Right.
But that is a marker that has historically been shown when it's modulated has no impact on mortality.
Right. But in this case, it's a good proxy for insulin sensitivity. And my point in mentioning that is that to substantiate the point that I made earlier, that anytime you stratify LDL and cardiovascular disease by a metric that has any relationship to insulin sensitivity, you see this change. You see an attenuation of the relationship between LDL levels and cardiovascular disease.
So the assertion would not be that HDL is protective. It'd be more that you would only see it lower in the concurrent situation where that patient likely had hyperinsulinemia kind of thing. All right.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm not saying that HDL is the best marker.
Sure.
I was clear about that earlier. It's that it's a proxy of insulin resistance because there are studies that show that insulin resistance is a huge risk factor for cardiovascular disease progression. Of course, I think most people accept that. There are studies that show that in men, when they have low HDL, high triglycerides, or the reverse of that, which is something that Dave calls the triad, but it's, again, metrics that are reflective of insulin sensitivity. So low triglycerides, high HDL, their association of cardiovascular risk with elevated levels of LDL is significantly different than people who do not have that lipid profile, who do not have insulin sensitivity reflected in their lipids. Again, we're using proxies because there's no study that I'm aware of that's actually looking at fasting insulin levels or OGTT, oral glucose tolerance testing, and lipid levels in cardiovascular disease.
So instead of using proxies, though, wouldn't it be safer to not only do all of the lifestyle practices, sleep hygiene, et cetera, and optimize everything the best you can, but in addition, use pharmacology just in case when the side effects of the pharmacology have not, at least of current medication progression, is not that significant relative to what is otherwise a potential propensity to the highest cause of death in the country. Because it's like,
Who are we? No, I disagree with you. No, I wouldn't do that. So who are we talking about? Are we talking about someone that's insulin sensitive or someone that's insulin resistant?
both.
So you're asking me if I would recommend lipid lowering
Yeah, like
pharmacology.
somebody has like a low fasting insulin, and you can, from all metrics, at least discern that they're probably reasonably insulin sensitive and healthy individuals metabolically.
Right.
But then they have sky high ApoBs, LP little A's, all.
How high is sky high?
I don't know. Does it matter?
Well, do we have normal thyroid function?
Sure.
Then I think that no, I wouldn't recommend that. I guess do they have a genetic polymorphism we can tie to FH? Like how high is their ApoB? I mean, because what I see in myself. So if we
But it's like the actual classification of FH, even though you might disagree with it, it's like you could still have the numbers.
right.
And you could have a myriad of different ways you got there compared to the next person. So maybe it's not the one that you were referring to earlier, but you still arrived there via whatever unique predispositions you have. In that individual, you don't even know what genetics you have or don't have because they haven't been explored yet. So like, isn't it safer to hedge when you could use something that, you know will attenuate atherosclerosis development and has a relatively minor impact on quality of life?
See, that's where I disagree with you. I think, like, are we talking about statins? Are we talking about PCSK9?
Well, that's the thing. Obviously, there's different drugs that are more or less impactful on side effect profiles. So that's why I'm kind of asking, is there ever a situation because again, the classification, if you're genetically predisposed or if you fall into this camp of you have significant enough gene mutations for me to qualify you for drugs, like where does that threshold lie where it's like you're insulin sensitive by any metric that I can discern, but you still have like really high atherogenic burden potential, maybe via your lipid profile. Like, where do you draw the line of intervening with, and obviously the drug selection, like there are certain things you can use that are not going to cause myopathy or things that are really even noticeable from a side effect profile.
Right. So you're describing someone with a quote sky high ApoB.
Sure.
With a
rock bottom fasting insulin. And normal thyroid.
This sky high ApoB. I mean, my LDL-C is 150 milligrams per deciliter. Is that sky high?
Let's just say over the reference range.
Yeah. So I would be over the reference range. And I think,
just like in general.
And I think in this situation, absolutely not. I would never use a statin in this situation for me. I don't think anyone should be taking.
What's your ApoB?
I'd have to look at it. Yeah.
Do you have it by chance?
Let's see. So the last time I had my ApoB checked was March of this year, and it was 139.
Okay, so perfect. So
139 milligrams per deciliter. Previously, it was 93. So I had one that was 93 and one that was 139.
Okay, so like the 139 by standards of LabCorp, they'd be like, okay, you're kind of in sketch territory.
Right.
And by cardiologists, presumably, they would say similar.
Right.
But you have a rock bottom fasting insulin, or as low as you need it to be considered metabolically healthy and your thyroid's good.
Yep.
In that circumstance, any individual who fits this criteria without any obvious genetic predispositions through the traditional, at least known predispositions, because, it could be an array of things that we don't know about that exist, you would say no pharmacology.
I would
stick with
I would not take statins for me.
I'm not saying statins. I'm saying drugs in general, because we can get really progressive on some of these drugs that are very, very well tolerated in contrast to like the worst class of medications.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say pharmacology in that situation. I think
no bempedoic acid, no ezetimibe, no Repatha, nothing.
No.
Okay, so how would you track if you are progressing? Would you be getting regular CT angiograms, or like how do you?
You could do any of that,
or you just assume that you're good and you don't need to check that stuff.
So I think that you could get regular CT angiograms. You have to be aware of the radiation from that. But you have to. I mean, I think that we could get into a very nuanced discussion about all the drugs, but I think that there's enough evidence to argue that the risk mitigation is so significant when you are insulin sensitive without concurrent thyroid hormone abnormalities or other issues that I don't think drugs are indicated in the situation. I think the side effects of a lot of these drugs are underrepresented, and I don't think there's an indication there for medications.
So a lot of the pushback to that would be, the most highly prevalent cause of death, cardiovascular disease, much higher than cancer even in the States. And avoiding that, like for sure can be achieved via blood pressure being in check and also your essentially ApoB, LP(a) composition, etc., being in check. Like, that will achieve an outcome that is not going to be, you're stuck with a, clogged artery. The opposite, we're discerning and extrapolating and trying to make conclusions based on stratified data that is not conclusive and using Dave Feldman's new study and this and that. I'm not saying that's not useful, but it's like, don't you think the risk to reward here is kind of like pretty fucking significant of a...
No, I think it's an underestimation of the side effects associated with the pharmacology and overestimation of the benefits in people that are insulin sensitive. I think that the data that you're looking at to make this pharmacological decision is done in people who are insulin resistant. Like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, the majority of the population is insulin resistant. And I think that there's an overestimation of the benefits and an underestimation of the harms. So
some of the individuals that grow up with these gene mutations that cause them to have bottomed out lipids that led to the development of some of these drugs like PCSK9 inhibitors,
right,
they don't seem to have any issues during development. So how would you qualify that is like an intervention that is,
they don't seem to have any issue? I mean,
development-wise, are they, stunted in brain development, maturation, skeletal infrastructures, or anything you could point to as like a definitive metric of issue?
I think that so when we're looking at this, I think it's important to understand that I think that there is a design in the human body. And for us to believe that humans can use a monoclonal antibody like a PCSK9 inhibitor with impunity is a bad thing. I think it's a bad decision. I think that it's really important that we carefully look at the long-term implications of these medications. And
right, but like, let's just say we track somebody, which has been done, that has a propensity to this thing.
So
that
you're
we're
saying
trying to replicate.
you're saying there are no negative side effects to PCSK9?
I'm just saying the risk reward trade-off, because like you're trying to assess as somebody who has a super high ApoB, you're insulin sensitive, you watch Paul Saladino, but you also watch, traditional media, I suppose, or people who have the opposite side. Like, how do you make your call on, I hear that cardiovascular disease is the most likely thing to kill me and is going to kill most people I know. I have to trust Paul based on an extrapolated HDL as a proxy for insulin sensitivity stratified in this subsect of data, that I'm going to be fine and I shouldn't take the suggested Repatha or whatever that has a side effect profile that is like worst case scenario. Like, it doesn't seem like you could even speak to what the side effects is when I'm asking you. So
if we want to, we can go down and talk about the side effects of all the problematic medications, or we could do that analysis if you want. But I think that it's a tricky thing here that...
Oh, for sure. Like, I'm not downplaying drugs, by the way, either. Like, to be clear. I mean, like, these are lifelong
the side effects with statins are well documented, and I've seen it, and I think they're absolutely underrepresented by the pharmaceutical companies. So statins, without a doubt, massively more side effect profiles than people are accounting for. I've seen it.
So what if you're like, okay, I'm not going to use a statin, even though I think some of that might be overstated. But
you think some of that's overstated? I think it's understated.
Perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it depends on the drug. I think it depends on the dose, the frequency. But regardless, let's just say you're on bempedoic acid instead of a statin.
Right.
So
now, what are the outcomes data for bempedoic acid? So my impression is that that there is a very different...
Well, my understanding is the people wwho attenuate their ApoB via pharmacology have a complete halting of their atherosclerosis development and live normal lives.
See, I would disagree with you. I think that there is an underrepresentation of the potential side effects to long-term attenuation of LDL to that level. And I think that this is something that's being talked about without enough attention to details here. I think that for people in the lipid community to say that we should have levels of LDL similar to a newborn baby, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I think that there are lots of questions remaining in the space about what level of LDL lowering is actually safe. And I think that the long-term data there is not fully fleshed out. So I would
say an ApoB of 70.
An ApoB of 70. I think that's pretty darn low, man. Does that occur in any free living human?
Not really. But at the same time, could you point to any reason why it's not going to be, the ROI on the risk is not worthwhile if you're
So we
somebody
don't-
who like
we
can't
simply-
lower your ApoB naturally.
But you can't say that we know for sure that ROI favors that. And I'm saying,
Well, you can follow people who have familial hypercholesterolemia and then crush their ApoB and then don't end up with heart disease.
completely different situation where we talked about that are not
Maybe, but we don't know.
No, we do know, Derek, because I told you earlier that people with familial hypercholesterolemia often, when we look at the research, have baseline.
Often, not all though.
Well, in the studies that I've seen, like we're looking at massive differences in the metabolism of LDL cholesterol, lipoproteins, and their macrophages. So I've not seen something that says that they don't have that, but I'm trying to be careful with my words, and I can't say 100% of the time because I've never seen a study that actually shows that the macrophages in someone with FH have normal cholesterol metabolism. But I've seen multiple studies that show that the macrophages in someone with FH have disordered metabolism. So I've seen multiple studies there and never seen a study that shows that they have normal metabolism. So I'm going to say often, but I don't have a study to say that they have normal cholesterol metabolism in the macrophages. So given anything else I've seen in the literature, yes, in FH, you quote unquote, if you're going to push me there, always have disorders in the macrophages based on the literature. So FH is a situation where we're completely different. And there are case studies in FH where people have elevated levels of apolipoproteins and do not develop atherosclerosis. So that's interesting to me too. Like to say like, okay, here's a case where somebody didn't have any of these things. And you're saying like risk ROI. And I'm saying I do the calculation differently, and we'd have to really go down into literature to finally do that if you want.
But I'm just trying to wrap my head around how you're saying essentially that it's like, it almost sounds like you're saying it's unnatural and probably not good to use pharmacology to manipulate the ApoB simply because it's not representative of what a natural could achieve.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, because it's like I would circle back to the genetically predisposed to having low ApoB numbers and never developing heart disease, and then the replication of that.
What's their mortality? So this is the other problem: is that are we just looking at cardiovascular disease? Are we looking at vitality? Are we looking at total mortality?
Initially, I would say the maturation development of them through adolescence into adults. Do they have any actual metrics that we can point to of stunted brain development, cognitive health, cardiovascular? Like obviously cardiovascular, it's attenuated entirely, and they're good on that. Skeletal muscle, bone integrity. Like, is there anything there? Fertility that you could say is actually hindered dramatically by, or hindered at all by having these low numbers that are like, threshold, like that looks really low. Why would you ever want to crush your numbers to their territory?
But you cannot tell me that you have enough data to say that throughout their lifespan, their mortality, their death, when they die, their morbidity, that they're the same. You cannot say that. That's absolutely a misrepresentation. You can tell me that there are some metrics whereby their development looks okay, but tell me with confidence that their long-term mortality, their longevity, none of these metrics are modified. That's ridiculous.
Well, my understanding is they don't die of atherosclerosis.
Of course.
Yeah.
But but that's ridiculous, Derek.
Well,
you can prevent someone from dying of atherosclerosis and give them death from something else. A lot of the studies show that if we're looking at total mortality.
So what are they, like you're saying there's no data to show what they're dying of?
There's no data to show that having an LDL of a sub-physiologic level LDL that would never be achieved by a human under any other circumstances is actually going to lead to no problems in the span of your life, in the vitality.
I never said
of your
no
life.
problems.
That's what you're inferring.
No, well, I asked first, and then you kind of like dodged it, to be honest.
Okay.
So like, let's go back to the no problems thing, because I don't want to say there's no problems if there's problems.
How did I dodge it?
I said in the maturation of a human through adolescence who is genetically predisposed to low ApoB, which is the actual development of what some of these drugs were derived from, is these individuals, they seem to have no metrics of stunting of their maturation or any actual metrics of impairment that are notable whatsoever.
In their development, but tell me about their longevity and what they die of later and the mortality, right?
Well, I don't have to tell you that at all. Like, you tell me, bro. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to figure out.
That data is not available.
Okay. So you're saying that in individuals treated with PCSK9 inhibitors and whatnot, like there's nothing we can point to as to, like, other than their ApoB's lower, you're lowering the wood on the fire, even if there's sparks, but it's still just like we don't know what happens to them at the end of the day and if they die sooner because of the drugs.
We don't know that. And we don't know about what happens to them in terms of their longevity and other potential problems of mortality. We don't know
Like,
that.
haven't these drugs
They have not
existed
been
for
around.
like...
No, they haven't been around long enough. We don't
Like
have that data.
ezetimibe even? Like, some of these drugs have been around for decades.
But ezetimibe, what's the outcomes data with ezetimibe? It's pretty poor.
I'm pretty sure the combo therapies or even monotherapy have shown attenuation of atherosclerosis. Like, that's my understanding of anything that modulates ApoB down.
That's not true. No, that's not true. There are definitely drugs that lower ApoB that have no effect on cardiovascular disease or mortality.
But how dramatic of a downward pressure is it on that number, and where's their baseline to begin with?
Exactly. So, I mean,
if they're hitting, like when I gave the example of 70, like that was just like a threshold of,
right.
You said it's not, something you could achieve naturally. So that was kind of what I picked out of a hat kind of thing. And what I've heard as well is kind of like a target of, similar to your insulin number, how you have a target of what you think is quote unquote good enough to not end up in a predicament of atherosclerosis,
right.
pending thyroid function and everything is on point. That's kind of the number that people point to for ApoB. So it's like, I'm just trying to look for reasons why I shouldn't be preventatively treating an ApoB that is, super physiologic with some of the more progressive drugs that really seem to have nothing I could point to that states conclusively that it's going to impact me negatively in the short time frame or long-term horizon either.
I think that the long-term data is questionable and isn't. I don't think I'm not as confident in the long-term data as you may be.
But the long-term data on high ApoB is pretty definitive in that, pending the sparks are there, you will likely end up with atherosclerosis. So it's like,
yes,
you're kind of.
Do you have insulin resistance?
Sometimes. I'm on 1 hour sleep right now. I'm insulin resistant as fuck probably right now.
Yeah.
So like, no, I feel like we're kind of framing the situation in that everyone's always going to be perfect always, which I feel like is probably not the case. Like, most people don't have access to the highest quality food you do. They're not doing surfing every day for hours.
Right.
They're working like sedentary desk jobs,
right.
having unnatural circadian rhythms, have stress from their families, are, maybe paycheck to paycheck and always like, glucocorticoids fucking topped out all the time. Like, there's a lot of situations that are not natural that they're in that I feel like might put them over the edge of, you're not in the perfect metabolic state perpetually to say for certainty that you couldn't benefit from like a little bit of pharmacology as like a touch up just to kind of like attenuate your risk. It's like, how many people really hit the perfect mark that you would deem as...
I'm not saying that people need to hit the perfect mark, but I'm saying that if your foundational metabolic health is good, your body will also recover. I think that at some point, going back to our earlier part of the conversation, we all get endothelial damage. And I think that we didn't even talk about this yet, but the contrary or another hypothesis around the formation of atheroma is the response to injury model at the level of the endothelium. So if you believe that atherosclerosis starts with endothelial damage or impaired endothelial remodeling, impaired efferocytosis at the level of the endothelium, then I think that we're all going to get some endothelial damage at some time. We're all on planes. We're all exposed sitting next to a smoker at some point behind a diesel truck, getting some heavy metals, right? But I think that on the whole, if someone is metabolically healthy, the body has ways to remodel that. We know that plaque can regress. We know that these things can be remodeled. So no, I don't believe that because you're on 1 hour of sleep, if you, Derek, are overall metabolically healthy and doing good things, you should be on a statin to quote unquote top you off. I think that my judgment...
But I'm not saying statin,
okay,
to be clear.
Okay, that you should be on any pharmacologic therapy. Okay. My judgment there is that no, that the risks outweigh the benefits clearly in those things.
But like, how do we know the risks outweigh those things if we're talking about the more refined, newer drugs?
So now you're talking about PCSK9 inhibitors.
Sure. I'm just trying to use examples of things that are representative of like modern medicine as opposed to like really old stuff that even if you had a myopathy outcome, you could otherwise just replace it with bempedoic acid or maybe get the full outcome you're seeking in ApoB suppression through just the PCSK9 inhibition or whatever.
Well, PCSK9 inhibition is pretty strong, so you're going to get a significant reduction. But I think that the long-term safety data is just not there with PCSK9 inhibitors. And I think that, again, that my perspective is that humans...
So the proposal is that the data is not there rather than like, as opposed to definitively there's some sort of side effect you will likely encounter.
With
With the more refined drugs.
Even with, what do you mean the more refined drugs?
PCSK9 inhibitors or ezetimibe is really old, but I think it's pretty benign as well.
Yeah, I think that humans, if we looked carefully, that humans would encounter side effects there, and that they would be better served by focusing on foundational things rather than doing it with medication.
But we're not saying to do one or the other. We're saying do both.
And I think that,
or at least that's what I'm asking is like, why is that not worth the, the ROI calculation there? Like you're basically saying
right.
long term, you think that it's probably more likely to result in side effects or
yes.
early death that are going to hinder your quality of life significantly enough or reduce your lifespan entirely to some detriment that is significant enough to justify not manipulating ApoB at all.
In someone that is doing everything else right.
Yeah, even though their ApoB is clinically seen as problematic, but in the presence of low insulin, thyroid values are correct, etc.
Yeah. And this is a little difficult without seeing an actual patient chart. And I think this is an individual conversation, right? This is an individual decision that someone has to make.
But why is it individual if you would never recommend drugs unless they're genetically like in the hyper extreme FH scenario?
Right. So I guess what I'm talking about here is, this is the way that I've made the decision for myself.
Okay.
It's and these,
I just think a lot of people would, sorry to interrupt, but would take away from your content that you're against it for essentially everyone. Because it's like a lot of your videos are bite-sized chunks too, which I think leave out a lot of context. And I'm just trying to like see if there is some level of, in people that are very prone, like this is where there is some threshold whereby pharmacology is worth consideration.
But you didn't frame this to me as somebody that's very prone.
Well, I'm just giving a spectrum of like, is there a level at which you would say potentially, and it seems like that is kind of your threshold is extremely genetically predisposed with like the most aggressive form, whatever form you want to call it, of FH is kind of like where you draw the line. And then anything before that with no discernible, like brutal genetic predispositions, you just seemingly have like a, idiopathic high ApoB, good fasting insulin, thyroid values, you'd be like, ignore it.
So you're saying idiopathic high ApoB. I don't think that, I wouldn't even necessarily characterize an ApoB that's high, right? In like my ApoB, like it's just based on what we think are the reference ranges, right? So why are we saying that's a high ApoB?
Well, relative to, I'm just saying like based on a reference
relative
range.
Like
it doesn't need to be high.
Relative to a population that's eating seed oils, relative to a population that is doing other things in their diet that are lowering.
Yeah, so instead of saying high,
ApoB,
just say 130.
For ApoB.
131, because that's like what on the reference range it's showing.
The reference range is showing above 130.
Well, it's showing below 90 is technically where you're red flag, but I mean,
right.
I was just giving you like the very high segment as like an example.
Right. And interestingly, I don't know if you heard this, my previous ApoB was 93. So there's actually variation. And then, so again, it's like, here's another reason that I would be hesitant to jump to pharmaceutical therapy because I can shift my ApoB probably with my sleep, right? The 139 is probably a time that I'm a little bit less optimal because I had a previous ApoB of 93 eating the diet that I eat right now. And then I go to 130, I forget, it was 138 or something, and if you look at those labs, they looked like something was a little bit off, then you can shift. So you can shift the ApoB. And I think that there's, again, are you talking, I guess this is what I'm struggling with at this point. Are you asking me?
Well, it's like even for you see pretty dramatic shifts, right? So I'm just saying like even in the transient acute period of time, snapshot in time, you had that number.
Right.
It's still to be ignored in the presence of the other stuff, given that you don't have any genetic, like notable significant mutations.
Not ignored.
Okay. Well, like you're doing everything you could be naturally, presumably.
It's to be considered in the context of everything else I'm doing, knowing that I had a previous ApoB of 93, right? And that I'm not eating seed oils, that I think that my suspicion is actually that in some ways the quote reference ranges for LDL or ApoB may even be skewed by a population that's generally eating a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which could be lowering their ApoB in a way that isn't necessarily reflective of cardiac risk. So why are we're using these arbitrary reference ranges and then making decisions? I think that, again, I see it a little differently. I see it as overarching, broad framework of metabolic health in humans without known genetic mutations, without clearly documented thyroid abnormalities, who are insulin sensitive. I think in that human, if you have an ApoB in, maybe between 90 and 130, I wouldn't always, if it were me or my family, for me, because that's all I can do, right? I'm not giving medical advice. Like if it were me, I wouldn't jump to pharmaceutical therapy. I think that looking at the entirety of the data regarding the pharmaceutical lowering things across the board, that there's not enough evidence in my mind to suggest that the risk is worth the benefit. Does that answer your question? We've been dancing around this, man.
No,
I feel like I'm not.
Yeah, I guess I'm just having a hard time being convinced that it's like, something that should be assumed to be taken care of entirely when all other factors are accounted for. Because it's like, I don't necessarily see data showing the exact person that you describe as the low insulin, the perfect thyroid values, a situation where that's going to be perpetually sustained, and know that because like these are all snapshots in time. And even you have like a pretty flexible lifestyle in general. Like you have people who take care of your company on your behalf. You get to be the front facing marketing and make content around it and whatnot. A lot of people don't get the luxury of even as much flexibility as we have to do the jobs that we do. So I'm just like trying to imagine these transient states of even like fluctuation, trying to assume that they're never going to be atherogenic.
Right. So what you're kind of describing to me is an impossible situation to answer, Derek. You're putting
So that's
levels and levels of complexity.
Yeah, that's where the hedging against it comes in. Because it's like you could still not point to a reason why PCSK9 inhibition is going to guarantee fuck you up. If I lowered your ApoB to 70 with pharmacology, with the most modern and progressive of medications, not old statins from decades ago, there's really not anything that shows, above and beyond the risk of keeping your ApoB at like 140 plus. Like data would suggest that the medication route might be the better choice for the average layman, is all I'm saying.
I think that, I see where you're going with this, and I think that it's a tough.
I'm not trying to get you to agree with me necessarily. Yeah. I'm just trying to be like convinced otherwise personally.
No, I hear you. I think that it's a tough call. I think that it's maybe I would just say it's a gray area. I think that there is. I see your argument. I think it's interesting. I think you can make that argument. I'd say it's a gray area. I think it's tricky to know what the right decision is in that situation.
Because I would say,
I think that it's tricky. And I think that in that situation, if somebody were to take a PCSK9 inhibitor, they would derive information for themselves, right?
Okay.
And so these are reversible, presumably. I think that it's not a decision that I would make. Mm-hmm. But like other things that I've talked about in my content, you could, if you were concerned about this and you felt the way that you do, that you couldn't really make a compelling argument against it, mm-hmm. based on what we know at this point in 2023 with our knowledge of lipids, you could take a PCSK9 inhibitor and see if you have symptoms. And I just think that the concern would be don't minimize those symptoms and the quality of your life. And then I think that we don't have great data about the long-term effects, specifically, because we keep coming back to this, of PCSK9 inhibitors in humans. That data is not around. These are new drugs.
It's kind of hard to know as a layman, like the ROI calculation, when you know that the leading cause of death is I'm more likely to die from heart disease than anything. So do I take this potential side effect, or do I just trust that my ApoB of, one whatever with my insulin sensitivity is good enough kind of thing?
And I like your framing that our lives are not perfect, because I would say, and this is always my bias, and perhaps people would criticize me for this, I think you can look at free living populations of humans as some indication. I mean, we're all going to die of something, right? I think fearing death, I'm not saying that you have a fear of death. I certainly have a fear of death. I think it's a really interesting mm-hmm. philosophical thing to grapple with as humans. And for whatever reason, heart attacks are terrifying for people, but so is dementia, or so is a stroke. But I think we're all going to die of something. So none of us gets out of this alive. And so we need to look at total mortality and I think overall quality of life long-term in humans. And I think you can look at free living populations of humans. Now, granted, their lives are probably different than ours. They're not as stressed as us. And they may have, I'm talking about hunter-gatherer populations, or populations in the Polynesian atolls, right? These populations are insulin sensitive. They have significant amount of saturated fats in their diet. They have elevated levels of lipids in some cohorts of these people, like the Chimene, if you stratify them, some of the Chimene, which is a Bolivian horticulturalist, hunter-gatherer / horticulturalist population, they have low rates of cardiovascular disease and similar rates of at any given level of LDL. In the Chimene specifically, the study I'm thinking of, they have lower rates of cardiovascular disease than us, and their rates of cardiovascular disease are not normal. So some people are going to get it, but I think that we see populations of free living humans with very, very low rates of cardiovascular disease who are doing things that.
Like, what's a low rate though? Because it's like proportional compared to something that's abysmal for the U.S. or it's like what are we calling low exactly?
Yeah, we could pull up the study.
Sure.
Does that make sense though? I mean, the point that I'm making there, I guess.
Yeah, like and just to clarify for anyone watching, if there's any doubt, because I see the comments that for some reason, even after listening to the super nuanced conversation, will still somehow boil us down to, oh, LDL bad equals you want to take drugs or don't take drugs. Like, that's not, there's so much stuff we're talking about when it comes to, no one's saying don't focus on metabolic health or don't focus on your diet first and foremost. Like, there is very significant low-hanging fruit things you can do naturally before you go the hardcore route, and that includes basic weight loss, exercise, calorie restriction if needed. Like, no one's saying to overlook that. So I think maybe it's worth highlighting from my end, because I don't want to come across like, eat shitty food, eat in a surplus, don't exercise, take drugs. Not what I'm saying.
Right. And earlier in the podcast we talked about nuances regarding diet, and we can circle back to that. I think we should, because I think that also talks to or has relevance to LDL risk and stratification.
The diet of these tribes that are not that prone to cardiovascular disease, proportionally they're eating, like, what is the diet model typically?
It depends on the tribe, right? Because there's different parts of the world.
What's the lowest risk of cardiovascular?
Oh, you want to know? You're asking me that question.
Yeah, like what's the diet of like the people who are doing it the best? Because presumably, like, your stance is essentially that in general, except for the most genetically predisposed, you can modulate this all via natural methods, right? So like
not modulate all of it, but I think you can significantly attenuate your risk
enough that you're not concerned to look at CT angiograms or take drugs.
We talked about CT angiograms. I think that's maybe a reasonable thing to do as a human. Drugs, no.
By the way, as far as like exposure to radiation, like how significant is it from a CT angiogram if you're getting it regularly compared to somebody who's like, let's just say I'm on Repatha and I have a ApoB that is so low, I never have to worry about getting a CT angiogram because it's just impossible. Versus I get it done regularly because I'm natural and I have an ApoB of 150 and I want to hedge against making sure nothing's building up.
Right.
Like what's the ROI on that?
I don't remember the exact amount of millisieverts in a CT coronary angiogram, but these are interesting calculations that we could try and make back of the envelope. These are questions.
Well, I just don't know how risky the radiation exposure is either. Not that I'm saying to do one or the other. I'm just curious because that's obviously a consideration if you're monitoring this regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have had a CAC in the past. I had a coronary artery calcium scan in the past, and I looked at the number of millisieverts. It depends on the actual scan. We could look it up, but I know a CT angiogram is more than that.
But that would be the test you want if you're assessing.
Yep. But I think that, the thing is with a CT coronary angiogram, you could probably get them less than once a year in terms of plaque progression. I guess it depends depending what level of ApoB you have and what potential level of atheroma progression you would have. I mean, if you're one of these lean mass hyperresponders with an ApoB of 200 or something, then maybe you'd want to get it more often. And this is, again, back to Dave's study. But so I think the title of this study is Coronary Atherosclerosis in the Indigenous South American, I think it's Chimene or Chimane. Again, every time I see this word of these Bolivian horticulturists / semi-hunter-gatherers, I do the how do I pronounce this online, and I get three different explanations of how to pronounce that word. It's Tsimane. So apologies, and if anyone can tell us how you actually pronounce that would be amazing. So they did a cross-sectional cohort study, all individuals who self-identified as Chimene and age 40 years or older. Coronary atherosclerosis was assessed by CAC scoring done with non-contrast CT imagery in Chimane adults. They look for the difference between the Chimene and 6,814 participants from the MESA study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. CAC scores higher than 100 were considered representative of significant atherosclerotic disease. So they looked at 705 individuals in the study.
What was the average age?
They said the ages were over 40.
Now, would you even have a CAC score in general that is representative of significant atherosclerosis at that age? Like, my understanding was you'd have to...
Well, these were people over 40. You asked me what the age was. I'm looking at the study because I don't remember.
No, but I'm asking you, like, is that an age that you would be able to get pull out data from that conclusion that is even worth hanging your hat on?
Right. I think that at 40 years old, it's very rare to have significant coronary atherosclerosis, which would be a CAC above 100 in this study. But they're saying N is 31, 40 to 44 years old. N is 298. I'm trying to talk into the microphone and look at my computer at the same time with this not ideal setup. 55, so 45 to 54 is 298 people.
You can move the computer in front more too. Like, I don't care if it's covering your face a bit. Like, it doesn't matter to me.
55 to 64 is 204 people. 65 to 74 is 124, and greater than 75 is 48. So I think in the study, a significant number of people were above 45, right? 45 to 75 years old. And if you really want to make the age cutoff 55 years old, you had, almost 450 people.
And this is in comparison to a data set that is...
MESA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it said, despite a high infectious inflammatory burden, these people obviously, I think, have CRPs elevated beyond the clinical range of 3 milligrams per deciliter because they have coexistence with parasites. The Chimene, a forager horticulturalist population of the Bolivian Amazon, with few coronary artery disease risk factors, have the lowest reported levels of coronary artery disease of any population recorded to date. These findings suggest that coronary atherosclerosis can be avoided in most people this is the author's words, by achieving a lifetime with very low LDL, low blood pressure, and low glucose, normal body mass index, no smoking, plenty of physical activities. Relative contributions of each are still to be determined. If you look at the breakdown of their LDLs, there are obviously quartiles.
Mm-hmm. So is it like a lower CAC score could be I don't think it's, crazy to see that somebody with a better lifestyle than average American is going to have better outcomes when it comes to atherosclerosis for sure. But it's do we know that they avoid this outcome to a significant enough degree that it's worth saying no entirely to pharma is like what I was kind of trying to lean at. Because like we said, it was much lower, but I guess the prevalence of there's definitely some percentage that has metrics that you can hang your hat on of like this many people die per year in the States of heart disease, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Like we don't know that for the population of these tribes or whatnot.
How many die from cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, like you said, it was lower prevalence. I'm just wondering,
the lowest of any population ever recorded, at least.
Okay, so proportionally, if we were to say, I don't know, in the States, X percentage of people die of cardiovascular disease versus in this population, it's, I don't know, like what percent of the population dies? I'd
have to look. I don't know, man. Off the top of my head, it's like,
that's all.
I mean, it's like
either way,
really good, really specific questions that I don't have an answer to off the top of my head. I mean, we could look. I think it's very low. It's significantly lower.
Like single digit percentages?
I think it is definitely single digit percentages. You could probably, you're on Wi-Fi, I'm not. You could probably search that right now.
Yeah, typing is really awkward in this.
You see what I'm telling you? That's what I'm telling you. I was doing the same thing in this moment.
Yeah.
They have low rates. I mean, you can look at the Hadza group in Tanzania that I visited. You can look at the Chimene. You can look at the Anamono. You can look at the Khoisan. They're all, as far as we can tell, right? They're hunter-gatherers or forager/horticulturalists. The rates of cardiovascular disease death, as far as we can tell, are very, very low, much, much lower than ours. And so then, again, I'm just trying to add data points.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. When it comes to their diets that they're eating, like obviously they're, doing things that are representative of practices that should be implemented by anyone trying to be metabolically healthy, like walking a lot or doing things that are going to keep you, partitioning nutrients effectively, not having elevated glucose for significant amounts of time, et cetera, et cetera. Their diet models and how they compare to like, I don't know, what you would consider optimal or what you eat, is it like, how does it differ or at all? Is it like...
I mean, the Chimene are forager horticulturalists, so their diet is maybe a little different than mine. They probably have more horticulture than I would eat, but I think that they're having...
So by that, you mean vegetables?
Vegetables,
Okay.
or perhaps some vegetables, perhaps some grains if they're growing the grains. But the foraging is going to be... You're not foraging too much for vegetables. People don't eat a lot of wild vegetables in these populations. At least the Hods don't. So the foraging is presumably going to be some hunting, berries, fruit, these kind of things, maybe tubers. This is what people generally forage in these populations. If you look at the Hadza population that I've visited and I'm more familiar with, they have 5 main foods: meat, honey, baobab fruit, berries, and tubers, with tubers being the least preferred among the tribe. So those are their main foods. They don't tend to eat vegetables because they're not a horticulturalist society.
The tribe that has the lowest rate of heart disease that we mentioned that eats not a lot of vegetables, but more than the other tribes.
Probably.
Like, how do we know for sure there's no impact of that on their rates of cardiovascular disease?
Now you're asking about vegetables and cardiovascular disease. I don't know, man. Like, we don't know.
Okay.
No,
So
we couldn't
it's
say.
Like, obviously, if you have access to micronutrient-rich foods, you want to allocate your calories to things you even like eating, like whatever it is. Like, how would you, you talked about at the beginning, the importance of food quality, how to determine what is a high quality food. You kind of mentioned some of the foods that you eat primarily. Like, oftentimes I find in these conversations, there's a leaning on it's unnatural to do, take a drug, or it's unnatural to do some sort of practice that it differs from, ancestrally consistent things.
Sure.
But then when you look at, what tribes are doing that have the lowest rate of heart disease, like, why would we not think to replicate, vegetable intake, for example?
I mean, if you want to do that, the Hadza haven't had a similar study of CT coronary or CAC scores. So I'm just telling you that what they've been recorded for their cardiovascular disease incidence is low. This is the tribe where they actually went and did, over 700 people with CAC scores in Bolivia.
Yeah.
So that's not been replicated in the Hadza. I don't know that that's a metric that I would use to tell you about vegetables.
Okay.
To circle it back to what we were talking about earlier about carnivore diets and vegetables, I certainly don't believe that vegetables are the main problem for humans today. I think that in certain individuals with autoimmune disease primarily, elimination of vegetables causes incredible improvements in health. But I think that many people can eat vegetables that are preferably organic, but do what you can with a lot of health. And the message that I've tried my best to make clear in the media that I've spoken about recently has been like, look, do what works for you. If you're thriving, don't change a thing. If you have an issue that's unresolved, maybe consider that there are ways to modify your overall dietary paradigm that could improve. And I think that for some people, elimination of vegetables improves autoimmune conditions. That's basically my message now. I think that based on what I've seen, my perspective is nutrient-rich, unprocessed whole foods, meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy. That's the majority of my diet. And then if people want to add vegetables, great. I'm not a huge fan of grains for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Seed oil is not a huge fan of at all for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate your time, and I hope that some of that had practical takeaways for people that they found valuable. And where can people find you for more info on this stuff?
Paul Saladino, MD on...
Which is notable because a lot of people think it's Carnivore MD.
It's not Carnivore MD. It's Paul Saladino, MD on all the socials. Yeah.
And it's all of them. It's not Carnivore on like...
No. It's
okay.
all of them are Paul Saladino, MD. Do you think we gave people like a takeaway or a summary? I mean...
I don't know, man.
That was kind of all over the place.
Sure. No, like there was a couple like clear subjects that we would circle back to, and I think that is, I'll probably try and get more granular from, the opposite camp, and then people can make conclusions based on what they think is the best available research on the subject, I guess, because it's like, what more could you ask? Like, I don't think anyone should expect to come into the podcast conclusively coming out with like, this is definitive, because even you yourself said that some of this stuff is proxies for the best conclusions you could make to guide your decisions, not necessarily because there's like definitive concrete metrics of like, here's a fasting insulin among the FH, patients or whatever. Like, you're doing the best you can with the data available and vice versa, So I think a lot of people just have to like, listen to as much, absorb as much as they can, and come to an educated conclusion. Like, even me, I don't have a clear takeaway, and I'm sitting right in front of you.
Yeah, it's tough. I think that though there are proxies for insulin sensitivity, they're reasonable proxies, and it's that pattern that I see that makes me think that there's more going on there. I think that in general, if I were to give a high level thing, not to prolong an already, have we been going 2 hours or more than 2 hours?
More probably.
It seems like more than 2 hours.
We paused a few times.
I don't know. The high level, with regard to lipids and atherosclerosis, I think that if you are going to say, and we started the podcast talking about, is ApoB causal in atherosclerosis? And I think that that's an important question. And I want to bring it back to the idea that I think that it's important to have these conversations because I want to understand, and I want us as a community to understand what the most important metrics are with regard to reduction of cardiovascular risk. We're not taking this lightly. As you said, cardiovascular risk is a huge thing for humans. And I think that also, as we talked about, we're all going to die of something. And if we can decrease our cardiovascular risk while also decreasing our risk of other diseases by potentially aligning the way that we eat and live with something that is compatible for our human physiology as best as we can tell from our outside looking in, then I think that that's a great outcome. And I think that when it comes to lipids, it's important to understand that I don't think looking at ApoB is the best single metric to look at cardiovascular risk. And I believe that because of all the things we talked about, because of the way that ApoB regarding to cardiovascular disease changes when you stratify for anything that reflects insulin resistance, when you look at other things that can change the susceptibility of humans to cardiovascular disease, like oxidized lipids coming from things in the diet. And I think that there is a significant change in our risk of cardiovascular disease. I would say a massive change, like a continental change. I mean, a huge, the biggest risk reduction that you don't see risk reductions like that with anything, right? So there's no intervention that you can do to a human that will give you the risk reduction that you see from just becoming an insulin sensitive human in these trials that I mentioned, or based on the proxies. And I think these are reasonable proxies. We don't have a study with fasting insulin that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean that HDL is not a reasonable proxy for insulin sensitivity. So there is no single intervention that you can do as a human that is better or anywhere close to becoming an insulin sensitive human with regard to your cardiovascular risk, regardless of whether we believe ApoB is causal in atherosclerosis or not. I don't think the data is there to say that it's actually causal. And I think that if we're actually going to look at ApoB as a causative factor in atherosclerosis, we have to be honest about the fact that ApoB enriched, or ApoB containing lipoproteins enriched in linoleic acid, are much more damaging to the endothelium than those that have lower populations of linoleic acid. Where does that come from? That comes from the diet. That's not questionable at all. So if ApoB is going to be damaging or in any way a proximate cause of atherosclerosis, there's an asterisk there, and that is that it's much worse when you have more linoleic acid and more polyunsaturated fatty acids in general in your diet. So going back to the single greatest thing you can do, even more than potentially, or just as much as lowering your ApoB, becoming insulin sensitive will lower your risk. And so then we have to have conversations about why are we insulin resistant as humans and how do you become more insulin sensitive? We didn't really get to that, maybe another podcast, but I think that the high level there is that it's pretty clear that insulin resistance, essentially the ground zero for that is in the adipocytes and the fat cells, and that broken fat cells send out inflammatory, potentially aberrant signals to the rest of the body, creating pathological insulin resistance in the body. So that there are these adipocytes that have had their ability to become hyperplastic and they're stuck in kind of this hypertrophic phase. They're dysfunctional adipocytes in insulin resistance. And when that happens, we become insulin resistant in a pathological level. And I think that there are lots of things pointing to the fact that there are downstream products of linoleic acid metabolism like 4-HNE that are worsening that process again. And so again, it's like that I think is potentially a way to tie it all together and give people some sort of a perspective. Don't be insulin resistant. Know how to check your sensitivity of insulin. And I would say that from my perspective, like we talked about, given that you have a normal level of thyroid function, given that you don't have a genetic predisposition to hyperlipidemia, like we talked about the FH, genotype versus phenotype aside, and become insulin resistant. And I think that significantly lowers your risk of cardiovascular disease. And I think that that's probably where I would leave it. Does that make sense? Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, I think like the main takeaway that sums it all up for me as well, because I get pointed to the FH literature as a proxy for potentially expected outcome for somebody who's also insulin sensitive and has high ApoB numbers or whatever.
Right.
So basically the takeaway on your proposed stance is in that data, those individuals that have accelerated atherosclerosis are not insulin sensitive like an individual who has a high ApoB but has the low fasting insulin, good thyroid values, and that individual is not to be apples to apples compared to this person.
Not to be apples to apples compared necessarily because of insulin sensitivity, but because of metabolic dysfunction at the level of the macrophages. Because we know that, and this is something I didn't talk about in the podcast. Again, we went all over the place, but perhaps now I'll throw in a few things to corroborate this model. Like,
hopefully you can acknowledge it's hard to stay organized in these subjects.
It is hard to stay organized, but the problem is that, when, from my perspective also, like if I'm trying to make a coherent argument, there are things that you think of like, oh, I should have talked about that too.
Yeah.
So there are situations, I mean, if someone is going to point out to you the FH literature with regard to somebody that's insulin sensitive, I would say, okay, that's metabolic dysfunction at the level of the macrophages. We'll wait for Dave's study, which I think I'm pretty darn positive is going to show us that there's something else going on here in an insulin sensitive population of people who have very elevated levels of ApoB akin to FH. And I think we're going to see something pretty interesting and special there. So that's going to really put, I think, the FH literature in context. But at least in this podcast, I wanted to talk about why the FH literature is not to be interpreted without a very major asterisk by it. And I'm happy to send you all that stuff about the macrophages there. But then there are multiple examples of people with elevated levels of ApoB that do not have accelerated atherosclerosis. And I'm thinking specifically now of GSD1A, which is von Gerke's disease. It's a glycogen storage disease. It's a genetic defect in glucose 6-phosphatase, I believe. And these people have elevated levels of ApoB and no accelerated atherosclerosis. So again, what's going on here? Is there something protective? We've never been able to find it in the literature. And again, I feel like these things with the GSD1A get left out of these Mendelian randomizations because these people are an outlier.
And they don't have atherosclerosis like at all, or
accelerated.
Lower...
They don't have accelerated, so they're just getting atherosclerosis at their age cohort, but they're
still getting it.
They still get it, but
despite
they just elevated ApoB.
But are they insulin sensitive to the level you would deem it?
They're only insulin sensitive as the general population is insulin sensitive, and they're getting atherosclerosis at the same rate as the general population, right? They're not getting accelerated atherosclerosis. So what I'm saying is there are examples like this of people with elevated ApoB who do not get accelerated atherosclerosis. So again, if ApoB is causal in atherosclerosis, that breaks the model. Similarly, there are examples of people who do not have elevated ApoB, familial, Dunnington, hyperlipidystrophy, or just Dunnington lipodystrophy. These people have monogenic insulin resistance, and they get massive, aggressive atherosclerosis with no elevation of ApoB. So there's, again, these things that sort of break the mold make me think there's something else going on here. And this, perhaps I'm mischaracterizing it, but this singular focus on ApoB, I think is missing the importance of the conversations around insulin resistance and the power of changing your insulin sensitivity for all these models.
I think perhaps the ultimate kind of like ambiguity is people being worried that what they do on the lifestyle front will not achieve the outcome of guaranteeing the spark of the flame. Like the wood they can manually manipulate, which they feel, gives them a sense of comfort knowing that some variable amount of spark, they can control it significantly through lifestyle, diet, etc. But it's like, at least with the ApoB number, you kind of know there's a target whereby there's not enough wood to cause the fire versus like the sparks, the insulin sensitivity, the ROS, the et cetera, endothelial damage caused by other things that isn't just inherent to the ApoB particle itself. Like it's a bit more vague as to knowing you're covered. So I think it's more like a sense of security too, in that like I don't know who is asserting that like just ApoB in the complete absence of sparks equates to like you will 100% get atherosclerosis at like a manic rate. I don't know if that's actually asserted.
I mean, I think that
like I don't think that. Like I obviously think that if you're unhealthy as hell, like you're gonna get way worse outcomes than if you were healthy. Like that's pretty common sense.
Right, but when people say ApoB causes atherosclerosis,
but I guess it's just the semantic verbiage.
Exactly, and that's important
because it's like the wood spark thing. I think is a good way to probably conclude in that. I think most people can agree the common sense behind this thing is needed, but it's not the only thing that matters, in that you need a constellation of other things to like combine and cause the fire.
Right, but remember that if we're staying with that metaphor, wood helps build a house, right? That LDL has value.
And then you get to the threshold amount that is necessary for the house, and that's probably where the disagreement comes in.
Right, and the potential long-term problems with lowering it beyond that threshold, which we don't really know what that is.
Which the traditional people would assert
it's pretty low. Exactly. You can also look at, there's also interesting data. So a complete lack of cholesterol formation is called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome. And these people, these children are developmentally disabled massively. And they're cured or helped by they're given egg yolks. They're given huge amounts of cholesterol. So they have essentially very, very low LDL because they can't make cholesterol, right? And so these children do have developmental disability. They do have insulin resistance. They do have many issues.
I think everyone knows there's a threshold necessity.
Yes, there is a threshold necessity. And the question is then, what is that threshold of necessity? I might argue that it's much higher than what someone else would argue if they're saying neonatal levels of cholesterol, which again, perhaps we need to do more things in terms of remodeling different tissues of our body as we age. Perhaps it's possible that neonatal levels of cholesterol are not adequate for humans throughout our lifespan for all the things we need to do. Formation of adult male and female sex hormones, remodeling of the brain, or anything that we do. And so and I think that my argument would be, and this would be an interesting conversation to continue with some of these people who are on the other side of the equation solely for the purpose of trying to help advance the collective knowledge, that LDL has positive roles in the human body, immune functions, et cetera. And, these are just associational studies, epidemiology studies, but in many of the most long-lived people, there are elevated levels of LDL. And so people have argued that, okay, there are these people with low LDL, which is what happens when you get a cancer or something. You get a cancer and your LDL levels drop. I've actually seen this clinically. Right before someone dies of a cancer, sometimes the lipoproteins go very low. And so they'd say, oh, that data is skewed by the fact that low LDL in cancer. And so then an elevated LDL might look good for longevity. But there are many studies. These are all associational because there's no interventional studies in humans where we can actually give them lipids. We never give someone LDL in today's world. But it's very clear that in these long-lived cohorts, there are actually higher levels of LDL. And so, but many of these studies that have been done, whether it's the Leiden 85 cohort or the Edinburgh studies, they have accounted for this. They've excluded people who died in the last few years from cancer to try and limit this bottom end artifact. And so there is data on the other end that this wood is valuable for humans, especially as we age in terms of immune function of the things. And so perhaps that's where it boils down to. But I think that the entire conversation must be framed around this idea, which is really how I get involved in this, which is I would say for most humans who are not ketogenic, is a 20% increase in ApoB going to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease in any significant way when you include more red meat or organs or nutrient-rich foods that also happen to be rich in saturated fats and lower in polyunsaturated fats? We talked about why those may have different effects on your LDL levels or ApoB levels. Is that going to affect your cardiovascular risk in any particularly negative or positive way? And that's the important part of the conversation, because my impression, perhaps it's wrong from the other side, and I guess I shouldn't make it so tribal, but the other perspective is that will increase your risk. And I think that there's a lot of things to suggest that it won't.
I would imagine there would be like a net, even if it was, there would be like obviously net benefit to having enhanced, vitality, health processes, functionality, et cetera, that again, it comes to the ROI side of the equation. It's like, because at average levels, like you could have atherosclerotic potential, and then even if you increase it 20%, it's like maybe it's the same potential, but like it could be equal, and maybe it's lesser so because you get higher quality health in the Sparks discussion. But it's like,
well, we talked about that, cardiovascular disease versus dementia versus diabetes versus cancer versus
those individuals that are
decrepitude.
Older and have that high LDL, by the way, do they stratify by insulin sensitivity in those to determine like why are they old and have these like longevity outcomes? Is it protective genes or what is it?
I've never seen it stratified by
so no one knows like why they're like living longer.
No, I don't think that anybody's looked at that. I think it's just cohorts of people that are living a long amount of time that are just they do see that the elevated level of LDL is often there. And so there's the inference is there's some benefit there, that if you presumably, one hypothesis would be, well, these are people who had reasonably enough good lifestyle and habits that they weren't terribly insulin resistant in their lives. And then you see them with perhaps ApoBs of something like mine, 130 or 120. And then that at least could potentially be protective in these studies as we age. And I think it could be protective throughout the lifespan, just that we see it more clearly in these people who are elderly because the signal becomes more clearly separated from the noise because the people that were insulin resistant or the people that had lower lifestyle level died.
Right.
So who are the survivors that show us that? So again, it goes back to the wood has benefit. So how much wood do you need to build a house? And I think that my hypothesis, which is just my hypothesis, is that, look, in a lot of humans that I work with and that I see, like an ApoB of 120 is not uncommon, or 90 to 120 or 110.
What do you think is the necessary amount? Or is it too specific of a question?
So hard. I don't know. I don't know how I'd answer that question.
Like a number that you would not feel uncomfortable seeing is like, dude, why is your number so low?
I think that I would actually approach it from a different perspective I would put some context in it. If someone is eating a very low processed food diet and they're eating nutrient-rich foods and they're getting a mix of macronutrients, and they're insulin sensitive and their thyroid is good as far as high level metrics, then if their LDL is, if their ApoB is 90 or 80, then that's where your body wants to be. But I think a lot of times, and I think there are genetics that probably modify this or moderate this, we do see about a 20% increase in ApoB when people have more saturated fat and less polyunsaturated fats. Potentially for the reasons I mentioned earlier, oxidative stress in the liver leading to degradation of ApoB 100. There's also a model called the homeoviscous model of adaptation, looking at the fluidity of membranes and the way that the body might insert cholesterol versus not insert cholesterol into the membrane to maintain the fluidity. So I think that the other piece of this equation, and I appreciate you giving me a little more time here to kind of just flesh this out so people kind of see more of the context of what we're talking about, is that elevations in ApoB, I don't believe, are always pathological in certain contexts. But as we talked about, not across the board.
Right. No, understood. All right. Well, I appreciate you, man. And thank you for sticking around to help kind of like consolidate it all and give what is hopefully some good summarized takeaways for everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity, man. I mean, I appreciate your perspective, and I appreciate you challenging me on things. And I think that I appreciate you calling me out on all things. I think that we are all trying to make art or content that is valuable for people. And I don't negatively view people that have different views than me. I'm not even saying that you had that negative a view or a different perspective than me. But I think that it helps us get better. And so I appreciate you challenging me with all that. And I think that's how we all learn, and it helps me refine the way I'm thinking about things. And I mean, there were things we talked about on the podcast that I hadn't, really in depth prepared for or thought we were going to talk about today. So that's good. It's, maybe I should think about that more in the future. Maybe I go back and we come back and we talk, or there's more conversations there. That's how we all learn. So I appreciate that.
No, absolutely, man. All right, everyone, follow Paul at Paul Saladino MD now.
Yeah.
And not Carnivore MD, the new one. And subscribe if you're not. Like the video, comment for the algorithm, and I'll talk to you guys soon.